Hello, everybody. Or at least everybody who is here right now. We're going to have to wait a little bit, I think, for people to start filing into the stream. But if you are here, feel free to comment or chat a little bit. So, today is our first stream of 2023. How about that? I wanted to do it a little earlier, perhaps over break. I know a lot of you are probably back to school or work or whatever you're doing in life, but I couldn't quite manage to do it over break, so we're doing it right now this weekend. The first stream of 2023. So today we're going to be doing a bit of chatting. The last stream was primarily a Q&A stream. Today we can certainly do some of that. We can talk about history. You can ask some questions, as always. I always like talking about that. And we're going to do some more of Extra History's Catherine the Great series. Hello, Light X Heaven. Back again, ready for more Sophie, aka Catherine. During the last stream, we did the first part of Extra History's Catherine the Great series. That was pretty fun. She's a very fascinating character, and I think Extra History does a good job making history a little more accessible, making it easy to understand, and then we can watch and add some commentary as we go, which is what we do in the videos as well, and also on the stream. So yeah, honestly, we might as well just start with that, unless anyone has anything else to say. I say we start off with the reaction, and then go from there. So, let me open up. There we go. Back to the classic History Student Reacts template. So, feel free to let me know if the audio's jank, if the levels are okay, or if we're getting too much latency, if we have any frames dropping, and I'll try to fix that if I can. But I say we start off with this reaction, Catherine the Great, part 2, not quite Empress yet. So last time, honestly, you know what, let's do a bit of a review of the first one, because it's been a while since we did it. The first one, we saw some of Catherine's early life. As she was a child, growing up, her mother...
A young girl sits alone in a cold room in a great house on the German coast,
Yes.
and dreams of being a queen. And to her mind, that required a male heir. And
Yes, and her mother, who wanted a male heir, but instead had to deal with her daughter, Sophie, and so seemingly put a lot of pressure on her and tried to live vicariously through her daughter.
so poor Sophia was neglected, often told that she was ugly, yelled at for minor offense, a decade younger. And so now,
Neglected up until she was the main child, her mother's best opportunity to get ahead in life.
at last, her ambitious mother's eye finally turned to her. But she didn't receive the warmth and the affection that she'd hoped for. Her mother's aim was to see her married. After all, so it was that
Male heirs are overrated. Yes, I mean, I do completely agree with that. But unfortunately, I think European society of the time may have disagreed, or at least most people. You could find a couple of people at this point who would have agreed with that male heirs are overrated take, but unfortunately, a lot of people would not have thought that. So, I mean, you understand the social pressure Catherine's mother is under, but, that's not really any excuse to treat your child so badly. Seems some very abusive behavior. And now we're getting introduced to Peter.
even before her brother died, on a visit to her uncle, Sophia met the orphaned Duke of Holstein, Peter Ulrich, 11 years old at the time. This young man was the heir to the throne of Sweden, and the last surviving grandson of Peter the Great. He was also
Wow, pretty impressive namesake, huh? I wonder if he's going to be as impressive as Peter the Great. Spoiler alert, not necessarily. Catherine was truly the last female ruler of Russia. Yep. Yeah, you are right. Welcome to the stream, by the way. But yeah, you're right. We had Catherine, and then we had a succession of male czars. Then, of course, we had the Soviet Union, which had exclusively male leaders, and then we had the Russian Federation, which has also had exclusively male leaders. So yeah, she was. She was also a pretty damn impressive leader. So our introduction to Peter.
Sickly, though, doughy of features, and even at the age of 11, given to drink. This meeting would prove fortuitous in years to come.
Starting early.
Or disastrous, depending on how you look at it. But long before that chance encounter was to change her life, as she was making the rounds looking for a suitor, attention of this type fell on her much closer to home. At the age of 14, a 24-year-old cuirassier, her cousin, began to...
Yeah, creepy cousin. We got that last time. Her developing relationship with Peter. Then I believe this is when we go to...
into Moscow.
Russia.
When they arrived at Berlin,
Yes.
Sophia's mother raced to present herself to Frederick.
Yeah, Sophia and her mother were requested by Frederick. They went. Sophia's mother tried to present herself, and Frederick the Great was all like, "No, we're not interested in seeing you. We want to see your daughter."
But to her shock, he simply asked where her daughter was. She hadn't taken Sophia with her to court, thinking that the king couldn't possibly want to talk to the girl more than to her incredible self. So she said that Sophia was sick. The next day, too, she showed...
No czar in my mind especially came close to living up to Peter the Great's legacy. Yeah, I completely agree with that. The two standouts are the two greats, Peter and Catherine. There is an interesting collection of czars that come after them, some better than others. But I agree, and I think what your comment is also suggesting is that in her younger days, Catherine at least made an attempt to live up to Peter's legacy and his ideal for a more European Russia, but I think he achieved more change in that respect than she did. Of course, Russia was already further ahead by the time Catherine came to power, but, she was interesting. I think Catherine's fascinating, very powerful. I have critiques of Catherine, though. She definitely did want a more European Russia, like Peter. She shared that goal. She embraced some Enlightenment ideas. We're probably going to see this throughout the rest of the series. But, later in life, particularly following the French Revolution, she would step back from a lot of those more Western ideas. And I think Peter was probably more transformative than Catherine was. That is true. That is very true. Catherine had a very impressive art collection, and I'm not an expert on Catherine, but, I know some about this time period, and I've done a bit of research on the Enlightenment figures, including Denis Diderot. I like Diderot, and he assisted Catherine in collecting a lot of her art in Western Europe, particularly in France. Though this was more a favor from her to him. She was basically saying, Diderot, you need some cash, you need some support. I'm going to give that to you. And in return, you can help me collect some of this art and send it back to Russia. Diderot actually helped cultivate that collection, as did a couple of other fairly prominent Enlightenment figures in the West.
Showed up at court alone, and again Frederick asked where Sophia was, and again her mother said that she was sick.
Yes, so Frederick wants Sophia, aka Catherine, and her mother's not interested, and then finally he basically demands for Sophia to come.
To just lend the poor girl a dress, please. Finally, Sophia appeared before the king, in an ill-fitting dress without jewels or finery. She was shy, worried about what this great man might think. But to her surprise, and undoubtedly the surprise of her mother, she was seated at dinner that night right next to the king.
Yep. So, without jewels or finery, a rather humble sight. Of course, they all come from aristocratic backgrounds, but, Catherine Sophia is from a more sort of minor background. Impressive, but not of massive stature. And, of course, the conditions upon which she's meeting Frederick aren't super favorable, but her intelligence, her wit, she clearly impresses him. Yep, Frederick he definitely dodged a bullet. He got lucky, frankly. He got lucky.
Her mother wasn't even seated at the same table. The king tried to make her feel comfortable, speaking to her of poetry and of the opera, plays and ballet. And though everybody stared at the king talking to a child, he continued on, and she...
I mean, look, you can say a lot of things about Frederick. I think Frederick the Great is remembered pretty well, but he's not a wholly positive character. But I'm sure he was a great dinner guest. I feel like that is guaranteed to be true. He was a fascinating guy, very knowledgeable, very intelligent. He would be a good person to talk to at dinner. Imagine getting to pick his brain. That'd be very interesting.
He opened up, speaking to him throughout the meal. By the end, he saw in her, hidden just below that layer of humility, an intelligence and a perception. He wrote to Elizabeth of Russia to say as much. He had been assessing her, because in his bid to make Prussia a player on the world stage, he had already created many enemies, and he knew that he would have to have Russia on his side. It was his hope that this German princess could help ensure that, but...
Yup, and as we can see here, of course they present Frederick positively, as a positive figure in Catherine's development, in contrast to her mother, but they also remind us that Frederick is not acting selflessly or anything like that. He's looking out for his empire, which is fair enough. I respect that. Yeah. That's an interesting comment, Light Heaven. Frederick the Great is not my expertise, and I particularly don't know too much about his military exploits, so I couldn't really comment on how good or bad a general he is. But he certainly had preservations in leadership. I mean, he was an impressive leader, the archetypical enlightened monarch, and he certainly put himself out there and led the way for many to follow. But it does seem he is also known as an impressive military figure, and you're sort of contesting that. And from the little I do know, I think I would have to agree. It does seem like he may not have been as brilliant as people sometimes make him out to be, at least on the military side of things. That's kind of what it seems from someone who doesn't know much about Frederick's generalship.
His business was not just with Sophia. In private, his agents asked her mother to be their agent in the Russian court.
Yep.
They explained how one Count Bestashev was the sworn enemy of Prussia, and that he would stop Sophia's marriage if he could. And so Sophia's mother, Johanna, should do everything in her power to make him lose favor.
Uh-oh.
Never again would these two rulers meet in person. These rulers whom history titles the Great. But it's far from the last time that their paths will cross. Join us next time as Sophia...
Alright, so that was just a brief recap of part 1. We're going to watch the rest of it all the way through, the rest of the series, as we would a normal reaction. I just wanted to get everybody up to speed who might have missed the first part. And by the way, a quick question on the performance. Are we doing good with the frame rate and stuff like that? At least on my end, I'm seeing, I think, a better performance than last time. I tweaked a couple things, so the stream should be a little more stable than it was last time. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I still experience frame drops when, like opening another video or opening a link, but, I tweaked everything, turned the resolution down so that my crappy old computer can handle streaming at least 30 FPS. So it should be at least a little steadier than it was last time. Okay, so let's jump into part 2. We did a brief recap of Part 1. Now we have Catherine the Great, Part 2, Not Quite Empress Yet by Extra History. This is exciting to get to, so let's jump right into it.
Two carriages strain against the muck and mud of the Eastern European plains. Inside, a girl and her mother sit, traveling incognito, under assumed names. Each day takes them closer to Russia. Each day takes them closer to destiny.
Yep, so in Part 1, we just saw Catherine talking to Frederick, and Frederick the Great, sort of setting them along to Moscow. Catherine was in line to be betrothed to the heir to the Russian throne, Peter. So that's where we're heading now. Yes. Mud in Eastern Europe, say it ain't so. And also, Shad Y. I agree. Like most people, don't know too much about Frederick's father, but it's my understanding, from what I know about Frederick the Great, that a lot of the foundations that Frederick built upon were built by his father. You know, Fred the Great, of course, really put Prussia onto the world stage majorly, but like you're saying, his father took it from this small, mediocre kingdom and had really already made it a European power, a regionally important power. And Frederick the Great really built on that. I know his father was a pretty strict fellow. He was also very pious. He was similar to his son in some ways. They both had the military discipline on lock, and that's how they ran their kingdom. But Frederick the Great was far more into the art and the poetry, the literature, the philosophy. His father was not really into those things. Like I said, his father was more a strict figure, a pious man. And so that stuff wasn't really up his alley. And, of course, I think Frederick the Great has sort of overshadowed his father through his accomplishments. And Frederick the Great is known for, one, his military accomplishments, his political accomplishments, building Prussia into this power. And he's also known for, the whole enlightened despot moniker, right? He made himself very famous across Europe by pursuing enlightened policy, religious toleration, all this kind of stuff. And Frederick the Great was pretty good at building up his own reputation, putting himself forward. Yeah, no, that's a good comment, Shad Y. That's some interesting stuff. And yeah, Light X Heaven, you're correct. Frederick was not so into his wife. Yeah. I mean, Frederick was, I don't think, he was gay, not bi. He didn't really seem to have much interest in women. So, yeah, he was not really interested in his wife. And I don't think his father didn't like that about him either. I mean, his father wasn't a fan of, the other stuff, like I said, the philosophy, the literature, but he also was not a fan of Frederick's sexuality. So yeah, Frederick's a fascinating guy, and he gets a brief feature in this story as he sends Catherine on her way to Russia.
For the first time in her life, Sophia was celebrated as someone special. Upon her arrival in Russia, the local fort fired its guns in her honor. People whispered of her presence as her sleighs chased the court from the Winter Palace to Moscow.
Wow.
When they caught up with Elizabeth's court, they were greeted by ministers, and then, to Sophia's delight, Peter himself. His fish-like appearance, nervous disposition, and his tendency to babble had not abated at all since...
I mean, that's a little harsh. He's a child, but, that's fine. Hello, Daniel Hughes. Welcome to the stream. And I'm sort of reminded, we're seeing the Winter Palace and all of this architecture of your comment earlier, Light X Heaven, about, Peter's accomplishments. At this point, Catherine obviously isn't empress yet, and she will achieve much through her reign, but I feel like we can see that, primarily due to the actions of Peter the Great, Russia has already been shifted westwards quite a bit. The Russian government, monarchy, has already been Europeanized quite a lot, primarily by the actions of Peter and those who followed. I remember when we were doing our videos on the history of Russia, I think by Epic History TV, they show portraits for each czar. And when you get to Peter, compared to those who came before him, Peter had a very European-style portrait. And then following Peter, basically every czar that came afterwards also followed that convention. And that's really sort of summarizes the changes to Russia in general. Peter comes in, Europeanizes, and of course after Peter there will be debates about how European Russia should be, and it will move westwards at times, and sometimes it'll, insulate itself a little bit more, but Peter really brings that massive change. Yes, fish-like appearance. It's a pretty brutal insult, but pretty descriptive.
They met when she was 10, but he was enthusiastic to see her, and her heart soared at the prospect of such a regal match. Then they were led in to see the...
Our heart soars at such a regal match. Yeah, that's gonna change a little bit down the line. But to be fair, we've seen, she's had it kind of tough in her childhood. I mean, of course, it's not like she grew up in the dirt, right? Like, she still grew up a relatively nice lifestyle. Not as nice as Peter or some of these other figures. But she also experienced a lot of abuse from her mother and was not treated super well. So you can imagine that for Catherine, it must be pretty gratifying to have some favorable treatment for once.
Empress. Sophia was overwhelmed by the dazzling splendor. Never in her life had she seen such majesty. And so the ensuing days passed with her at Peter's side. And with each passing day, she learned a little bit more about how boorish and unconcerned with his position Peter was. He told her about how much he loathed Russia. He barely even spoke the language, instead preferring German in all things. He hated the culture and the religion, planned to remain a Lutheran.
Yup, and all of this will remain important as Peter grows older. This stuff will not go away. And this is emblematic of something that was pretty common at the time, which is, we're talking about the 1700s. Nationalism will really develop in like the late 1700s through the 1800s. A lot of that stuff really kicks off in the 1800s. Before then, national identity is not nearly as important as it would become, particularly with the aristocracy. The European aristocracy was this international network of aristocrats that were linked to each other. And I think because, at this point, there is no unified Germany. There's like a million different German principalities, archbishops, states, whatever. There's a lot of them. Archbishoprics, I think is what it's called. A lot of German royalty ended up on thrones throughout Europe. Light Heaven says, to be fair, Russian royalty preferred German in all things most of the time. This is very true. And Peter, like I said, is emblematic of this trend. And we see going into the 1800s, I think of, say, for example, the Balkans. During honestly, through the entire 1800s, there is a lot of chaos in the Balkans as a lot of these Balkan peoples get all nationalistic and start to fight for their independence against the Ottomans. And what happens to a lot of these states after they gain independence, with the help of the European great powers, is that the European great powers will pick out some rando German monarch, German princeling, and pop them on the thrones of these newly independent states. Now, this will not work in the long term, because nationalism is rising, and for example, the Greeks form their own state. Man, they don't want some German on the throne, and this happens several times. I believe they also do it in Serbia and some other places. So, this is sort of an interesting trend that the European aristocracy will keep up past when it's really viable. And yes, the Holy Roman Empire is truly Voltaire's nightmare. Not holy, not Roman, not an empire. At one point, it had more influence than it does at the point at which this story is taking place. But at this point, as Shad Y says, the Holy Roman Empire is pretty much a general nightmare. I would have to concur with that. It's a mess. It's not unified in any way. It can't really marshal resources that well. It's just a disaster of, like I said, I don't know how many, hundreds, maybe? Hundreds of different small, tiny states. The HRE is cursed in many ways.
Even told her that he did not love her, and rather was in love with someone else, but was resigned to marry her because his aunt wished it. Meanwhile, Sophia began to...
I mean, look, I understand, these kids are dealing with arranged marriages, that's tough, but are you gonna tell your bride-to-be, yeah, so, I don't really love you? I mean, maybe, just try and get along with her, and if you feel they need it in the long term, you can be honest, but seems like a bad way to start the relationship off.
to realize that it wasn't Peter she had to please, but rather the Empress, Elizabeth. Yep. She took rapidly to her study of Russian and the Russian Orthodox faith. This pleased Elizabeth, but Sophia took to her studies almost too much, staying up late at night in the harsh Russian cold to continue her practice. Soon she fell ill.
Well, one, we're talking about Catherine really becoming immersed in Russian culture, which Peter didn't do. And LightX7 says, a German-Danish prince ruling Greece and assuming the Roman real name of Constantine. What could go wrong? Oh, what could go wrong, huh? What a choice. Very interesting. Wow. 1,800 different states. That's crazy. I mean, honestly, I think if I had to guess, I would have said maybe like 700. So 1,800 is crazy. And, of course, there was such a wide discrepancy between all the states within the Holy Roman Empire. We had some pretty powerful kingdoms and states in there, and then we had some states that were basically just one guy, his castle, and some farms, and that was it, with hardly any population. So the disparity was insane. Yes. Yeah, I mean, following... 37 is still a lot, but it's a lot more manageable than 1,800, I'll give you that much. Yeah. I don't know about Serbia. I know the Greek example, and I know there were other Germans placed on thrones in the Balkans, but I'm too rusty on Balkans knowledge to remember a specific result, so maybe Serbia did only have native dynasties. Even though I'm sure there were plots from the European great powers to put Germans on all the thrones. I'm not sure where else. I don't want to name another country and just be wrong, but, this was a sort of common trend at the time. Back to, Catherine becoming so infatuated with Russian culture that she researches herself until she's ill.
Elizabeth herself rushed to nurse her, but it was pneumonia. Not many survived that disease in those days, and her recovery was made all the more difficult by the doctor's insistence on bloodletting. For weeks, she lay at death's door. But as the sickness burned through her, rumor of how she contracted the disease spread. Her love of...
Yep, Germans took over the British throne. That's another very famous example.
Russia, for that's how everybody perceived her ardent studies.
But once again, and the point I was making is that I think today we look back and we're like, wow, all these Germans on, the thrones of foreign countries. But that's not really how they looked at it. Like I said, this was an international network of aristocrats, and, national identity would start developing around this time period, but, they still saw themselves as sort of interconnected, and if you'd asked any sort of aristocrat, say in the 1600s, they would tell you that they share much more of a common identity with an aristocrat from another country than they do with, say, their peasant. Say we have a British lord and a peasant. That British lord would not see any sort of shared identity with the peasant. Now, that would develop over time, of course, and feudalism would fade away, and the aristocracy would become less influential. But these are trends that we see continuing through a lot of the 1700s and into the 1800s, and rarely into the 1900s. Yep, yep, the Habsburg on the throne of the Second Mexican Empire. That's another really weird one. And yeah, antibiotics, wherefore art thou? If only we could have those sweet antibiotics. Fortunately, Catherine will be okay.
Was made known, and she became beloved, even as she slipped in and out of consciousness. Then came a moment where everyone thought it was the end. Her mother requested a Lutheran priest, but Sophia, with what little strength was in her, asked for an Orthodox priest instead.
And, I mean, I feel like this has got to be sincere. I mean, unless the story is made up, I don't know where they're sourcing this from. So, I mean, it could just be a propaganda piece that's been made up afterwards, but say it is real, that's got to be sincere. There's no way, when you're that desperate and feeling that close to death, that you would still remember to play the role of a devoted Orthodox Christian. I feel like at that point, she's got to legitimately be like, no, I want an Orthodox priest. Yeah, but I don't know. I find it hard to believe that she is still playing a game at this point, on the verge of death. Unless, she thought she wasn't actually on the verge of death. And like I said, this is the kind of story that people love to tell about monarchs that get twisted out of proportion and propagandized later on. So, it could be made up out of whole cloth, or it could be twisted in some way. I don't really know. But regardless, it very much fits Catherine's image.
And rumor of this washed throughout the land. But even as Sophia's esteem was rising, her mother's came crashing down.
Uh-oh.
Shortly after Sophia recovered, a series of letters that Johanna, Sophia's mother, had sent were intercepted. The King of Prussia had asked her to help him displace the Russian diplomat Bestashev at Elizabeth's court, and at this she failed spectacularly, vastly underestimating her opponent.
Uh-oh. Well, her mother's not doing too well. And yes, Augustus. We could talk about Augustus a lot. We might do some of that later. Augustus is a very fascinating figure, and we've been covering him in the Historia Civilis videos, while he was Octavian, or at least when we referred to him as Octavian. And I would like to do some videos on Augustus's entire reign. I know that Overly Sarcastic Productions has a video on Augustus, and I think we're going to get to that at some point, because, I think we've got one more Historia Civilis, the Battle of Actium, and then we're done with his series on Octavian and Mark Antony, at least for now. I'll react to them as he continues to release them. So I always like to get more Octavian/Augustus content, because we haven't really covered Augustus that much. But I have opinions on Augustus, and I know Light X Heaven does. We're always talking about them in the comments section of the Historia Civilis reactions. Really, I'm surprised that both of you thought of Augustus. That was not necessarily on my mind, but I mean, I can kind of see why. But anyway, on Catherine, though, we can certainly talk about Augustus more later. Or now, if we want to continue.
She got caught sloppily speaking ill of him, the Queen, and Russia. Elizabeth's ire was intense, and Sophia sat within the blast radius. A courier burst in on Sophia and Peter while they were playing and told Sophia that she was to pack, that she was to be sent away immediately.
Uh-oh.
Luckily, before her exile, she managed to get a moment with Elizabeth and humble herself before her. Elizabeth's fury abated, and she decided that the child could still marry her nephew. She even allowed Sophia's mother to stay.
Once again, Catherine's mother, I'm just saying Catherine because that's more clear to everybody, is trying to really mess everything up for her. And only through the charisma of Catherine herself is she able to stay in the court. Yes. Yeah, that is very true, Light X Heaven. Peter is not remembered very well, and I think it's fair. He loved to play soldier. That's the best way to put it. And as you said, he loved to play soldier with both toys and real soldiers. which already, being a grown man, which he's not grown at this point, but when he is a grown man, pretending to be a Prussian general or whatever and playing soldier, playing with toys, maybe grow up a little bit. But it's even worse when you're still playing soldier with the lives of your actual soldiers. Then, you've got a real problem on your hands. But I suspect we're going to see that in this series by Extra History.
Although her standing at court was greatly diminished, Elizabeth even accelerated things, pushing forward Sophia's formal conversion to Russian Orthodoxy so that the official betrothal could take place. But at the dinner after the betrothal, Johanna exploded in an outburst when she was not seated at the table reserved for royalty, saying that she would not be seated with mere ladies of the court.
Yo, this woman needs to, get a grip.
Elizabeth obliged her and sat her in a totally separate room by herself. With Sophia's conversion to Orthodoxy came a new name. She was rechristened Ekaterina, or as we know her in English, Catherine.
Hey, there we go. I can call her Catherine for real now. Of course, her name is Sophia, but names can be complicated. They change over time, particularly if you take a royal position. Changing one's name is a fairly common tradition. And here we have Catherine, as we all know her.
After this, Catherine spent her days in the royal life, dancing, attending court, going to balls, simply counting down the days until the wedding. But then tragedy struck. Peter was laid low with smallpox.
Uh-oh.
Catherine waited nervously for news. Eventually, Peter recovered, but he was disfigured, his already batrachian features now marred by the scars of the disease.
Jesus, we're going even harder on Peter. They said, look, Peter was ugly before, but now he's really ugly. It's hard to feel too bad for Peter, because he was very immature, he made bad decisions, and it feels like it was primarily his fault that he made those bad decisions. So I don't really feel bad for Peter. He has a rather ignoble end, which we'll see, but it's kind of hard to say that I don't know if he deserved to be murdered, right? But he definitely didn't deserve his position on the throne. He was not the guy for the job. And yeah, Daniel, they love making a point out of how ugly Peter apparently is, which, I feel like that's not the most important part of his character.
The first time Catherine looked upon him, she was horrified. But the illness also stirred a resolve in the Empress Elizabeth. The realm needed an heir. There was no time to wait, no time to risk some other horrible malady. And so, Catherine and Peter were married. The affair was grand, full of splendor. Catherine's dress was of the finest make, and she was decked out with jewels. All of the highest and most notable members of the court were there. There was dancing and revelry, and then, at last, the ladies of the court escorted her to her bedchamber. There, not knowing what to do, she waited alone. And she waited. And waited.
Oh, no.
2 hours later, Peter showed up,
Peter, come on, man.
reeking of alcohol, and crashed onto the bed, passing out in an instant. At last, her marriage...
Peter. Look, there's lots of examples of awkward royal couples, struggling to get it on, or one is not into the other. But Peter really kind of messed that one up. What? He's just like a bumbling idiot. I'm sorry. That's how he is remembered. And that, from all I know about Peter, that seems like basically how he was.
had freed her from her mother, but now Catherine had a new humiliation and torment. Her husband showed no affection for her, and spent all of his days playing buffoonish children.
Yeah, no, that is true, Light X7. Not consummating the marriage on the wedding night, big deal. Now, obviously, I don't give a shit. But it would have been a big deal at the time, though, like I said, lots of royal couples had problems making babies. I'm sure lots of them didn't consummate the marriage on their wedding night. It's honestly more the fact, that Peter is a buffoon. That's the thing. I'm willing to give people chances, but, every decision Peter makes, or everything he does, you're just like, well, this just seems like a stupid decision, Peter. Why did you do this? and we're seeing a sort of immature personality here.
Games, making his servants dress up like soldiers and march around his room.
Yep.
Even when Peter was eventually made to give up such things and sleep in the same room as his wife, rather than be with her, he would wait until dark when their governess was gone, and then take out his toy soldiers and have one of the maids move them across the bed as he ordered them about.
Come on.
This continued for 7 years. Then,
Yeah, and this is, by the way, that's more the problem. This continued for 7 years. Like, he is a full-grown man, and he's keeping up a lot of this behavior.
Catherine met a rakish young nobleman, far more knowledgeable in the ways of love than she. At first, she resisted his advances, but eventually she gave in. Soon after, she was pregnant. She suffered through 2 horrible miscarriages, and then, finally, a son was born. Whispers abounded as to the son's actual parentage, and though in both looks and temperament he seemed Peter's son, and not any of the young lovers Catherine had taken, the matter would never be settled conclusively. But that didn't really matter, for as far as anyone official was concerned, Russia now had an heir. And
Yeah.
so life moved apace, with
I mean, look, you would rather that the heir was legitimate, sired by Peter, but if you have an heir at all, that provides a lot of political stability, which is mainly what you want. So, they'll take any heir.
Peter and Catherine living separate lives with separate loves, with their little court outside the halls of power.
Yeah, and once again, this is not terribly uncommon for this era. It does seem like their relationship was particularly bad, but for a lot of these royal couples, these were basically arranged marriages most of the time. A lot of them didn't really like each other, and I mentioned how a lot of them were not into each other, and so having both partners, usually particularly the male partner, taking on a lot of other lovers. This happened a lot. And Catherine will become known for this throughout her reign. This is one of the things she'll become known for. Though, to be honest, I think the reason she's mainly known for it is 2 things. One, she's a woman. I honestly think a big part of why a lot of people emphasize all of the lovers she had is because of her gender. And I think the second thing is that a lot of the lovers she took, she clearly, was good at making selections. A lot of the lovers she took would go on to be her subordinates, They would go on to work for her in some way. So some of them became rather influential or important individuals. Peter III on Britannica Wiki. Next article is about Alexander the Great. Wow. Quite a jump.
Then Elizabeth died. All of a sudden, Peter was made emperor, and life changed. In 1762, he took the throne, and one of his first orders was to reverse his aunt's military policies. For years, Russia had struggled in the 7 Years' War, that same war that kicked off the American Revolution, and through doing so, eventually led to Bolivar.
Plug in their own series. I like that. I would love to do their Bolivar series eventually, by the way. I did that poll on, what type of history everybody wanted to see. And, Latin American history didn't do great. So, I don't know if this series would get that many views. But Latin American history is an area that I don't know much about, but I'm super interested in. I'd love to learn more about Bolivar. But yeah, anyway, the 7 Years' War. Super influential, fascinating conflict. I'm really interested in the 7 Years' War. It kicked off a lot of change on both sides of the Atlantic. As they said, the events of the 7 Years' War really kick-started the move towards the American Revolution. Not to mention that the 7 Years' War led to a massive swath of reforms across Europe. A lot of these governments, France is a good example, Austria, a lot of these governments were left broke from the 7 Years' War. Britain, of course, one of the reasons why the 7 Years' War will lead to the American Revolution is because Britain's broke and, they want to get their money back. But there are other examples, too. I mean, in some ways, there are a lot of events that led up to the French Revolution, but France being absolutely broke from the Seven Years' War is one of those reasons. They tried a couple of things to fix their finances. I think there's an idea that, Louis XVI did absolutely nothing, even though France's economy was in shambles. That's not true. They tried a couple of things, just none of the things they tried worked. They tried some free market reforms at some point, but they were incredibly unpopular. But yeah, so the 7 Years' War is just an incredibly influential conflict, and it led to a lot of change throughout, the world, frankly, but in particular in Europe and the Americas. The Bolivar plug felt a little out of place. I can get that. It's a bit of a reach. If they'd had a series on, the American Revolution, it would have fit a little more closely, but, whatever. It doesn't bother me that much.
Russia had exhausted innumerable men and material trying to break the might of Prussian arms. After so many years of fighting, they were on the verge of success. Prussia was nearing utter collapse. Berlin itself was on the verge of falling.
Yup, and this is what Light X Heaven was talking about earlier. Prussia was not doing super well. Prussia was struggling a little bit. They were in a pretty bad spot, and then this happens.
But then Peter offered Prussia peace, giving back everything that had been won by Russian sacrifice and strength of arms. It was the second miracle of the House of Brandenburg. It saved Prussia and Frederick the Great, but it sat ill with the Russian people. It sat even worse with the Russian military and nobility. Catherine was horrified.
Yep. Not a good decision. Look, the Shadwai makes a good point. Of course, the aristocracy was not that interested in improving the lives of their peasants. That's undeniable. But there were attempts to, so there was a group called the Economistes, aka economists. That's where that term originates, at least in the modern world. They wanted to implement new economic policies, one of which was a sort of unitary land tax. They wanted to take this complex tax system and boil it down onto one grain tax, and also liberalize the grain markets, right? And so Louis XVI tried to implement this in the years between the 7 Years' War and the French Revolution, and it was incredibly unpopular. A lot of peasants were afraid that the free market would disrupt their ability to buy bread, their ability to afford food. And so these free market reforms were completely done away with due to political pressure. And so I agree. I'm not making the claim that the French aristocrats were, cared about the peasants or anything like that. But it's not like there were no attempts to fix France's economy. They knew that it was bad. They knew France was in a ton of debt, and they knew that people were struggling. The aristocrats didn't care that much. They didn't think it would go that badly, and some of the attempts they made failed. And of course, there was disagreement amongst these groups. There was a lot of more liberal aristocrats, a lot of newly made aristocrats who had come from a more middle-class background, or middle-class families, who were more into these ideas of reform. But one of the big problems was that some of the more powerful aristocratic families, the aristocratic families who had been around for a while, were not interested in these reforms at all. They did not want to change the way things were. So, no problem, Shadwai. It's a complex situation. It's very interesting, and there's definitely nuance to it. I've made one mistake in my life. I should have destroyed Berlin. Yeah. Yep. Nobles of the road. Nobles of the robe and princes of the blood. That is how we distinguish between the two groups. I've also heard nobles of the robe and nobles of the sword. I've heard that term as well, which refers to nobles of the robe, these newly made aristocrats who might have worked their way up, Maybe they became aristocrats from serving the king, or managed to buy their position from acquiring a large amount of wealth, versus princes of the blood, or I've heard the term nobles of the sword, aka, those who have gotten to that position purely through their bloodline, and the term nobles of the sword refers to, those knights who fought with the king in the medieval times, and they were made nobles, and then their families passed that honor down. So yeah, that is the distinction made. It's very, very interesting, very complicated. But yeah, fascinating. But anyway, what we were talking about was the fact that Prussia was struggling in the 7 Years' War, and Russia had an advantage, and then Peter, because he's a fanboy of Prussia, decides to completely ruin that situation.
Was more concerned with his title as Duke of Holstein than being Tsar of Russia. He had just given up on the most important war in the world in order to turn all of Russia's might against Denmark so that he might restore some small claim of the House of Holstein that they'd lost years before.
Yeah.
And though some of his domestic policies were progressive and hailed as necessary reforms, for the most part, Catherine watched him blunder from one alienating act to another.
Look, the thing about Peter was clearly immature. He maybe wasn't the most intelligent guy. He wasn't suited to the job. And then he also, like they pointed out, was not interested in being Tsar of Russia. He didn't care that much about it, So, overall, not a great person to be Tsar of Russia if those are the qualities that you hold.
To another, even during the funeral of his own aunt.
Okay, yeah. Thank you for that distinction, Light X Heaven. So the swords were ancient nobility, and the princes of blood were descended from royalty. That's exactly right. So, these are those two groups, swords, blood, sort of our older, more powerful families, nobles, and then nobles of the robe are these sort of new fellas. So that's thank you for that distinction. There's a lot of terms thrown around. I get them mixed up sometimes. Hello, Roman. Hello, Messi. Interesting introduction.
While Catherine showed herself to be the model of orthodox humility and respect, Peter didn't even make an effort to appear to care about orthodox customs and made a mockery of Elizabeth's funeral.
And I mean, it's just, you're the Tsar of Russia, right? You should show some respect to Orthodox customs. I know that would be important to Roman. He's from an Orthodox country. That'd be important to him. But even if it's not, actually sincerely something you care about, you are the Tsar. And Catherine is intelligent enough. She knows she has to play the PR game, right? And she knows that she has to appear devout and orthodox. I think she probably was at this point, but more importantly, that's how you have to appear.
He would go even further with his contempt for the church, trying to secularize all church property, and even demanding that clergy shave their beards. But it really was the campaign in Denmark that doomed him. Such an act, so completely disconnected from the interests of Russia, showing such complete disregard for the honor of the army, or even the well-being of its men, was one step too far. And more foolishly still, against the direct counsel of Frederick the Great, the very man who he so admired, and whose peer he now considered himself to be, Peter let this little war pull him away from Moscow.
Yeah, I like your comment on Denmark Light X Heaven. Though, I'm not saying it's tainted by any sort of, nationalistic sentiment, but, maybe.
To remove him from the center of power and the court. Soon, a plot began to form to replace Peter. And at the center of that plot was his replacement, his wife.
Oh.
Join us next time for a coup, a coronation, and a queen, as Russia...
Oh my goodness. Alright, we will head into the next part. Yeah. Whoops. Yeah, Peter. Oh, Peter. It's not much of a surprise that he ended up how he ended up.
For months, Catherine, together with one of her lovers,
Gregor Orlov. Hello, Gregor. Alright, there you go. Yeah, I just think that Peter, like we said, he wasn't really interested in the position he held. He was foolish, he just not a great guy for the job. I don't know if he was like a super bad guy, but his disregard, particularly for the fate of his country and the lives of his soldiers, that's not great,
had been working with men high in government and the military to replace what they all saw as a disastrous and incompetent emperor, Peter. They'd been slowly putting out bribes and winning the hearts of the local guard regiments in St. Petersburg. But on the night of June 27th, it all came to a head due to a slip of the tongue.
Uh-oh.
June 27th, 1762. A soldier in one of the guard regiments in St. Petersburg gets spooked. He turns to one of his officers and asks if it's true that the conspiracy against the emperor has been found out. Turns out the officer he just asked is one...
Okay, so Peter disbanded the secret police, proclaimed religious freedom. So not everything he did was bad, right? And that's what I'm saying. I don't think he was necessarily like a super bad guy, but he was clearly not super competent either. Yeah, and this is also very true. How many times has history turned on the slip of a tongue or a piece of paper? Countless times. Many times we probably don't even know it. That's the thing. I'm sure there are a lot of events that if you tweaked something very small, they would not have happened that we do not know about. It's kind of interesting. History is these massive shifts and trends and events, but it's also the smallest little things. Someone saying something that's overheard, a slip of paper being lost, many different things.
One of the few who was not in on the plot. The soldier is arrested on the spot, as is one of the guard officers who is central to the rebellion. The time is now or never. The revolt must begin. The principal conspirators gather, panicked. A man named Panin, a man who would go on to be one of Catherine's highest officials, stays them, saying their freedom could only be assured for a few hours, so they must act, and they must act now. The brother of Catherine's paramour is dispatched to Peterhof, the palace outside of St. Petersburg where Catherine's staying. He dashes out and pulls aside the first carriage he can find. Money makes the driver push the horses hard through the night. Meanwhile, Peter is asleep at Oranienbaum, a small post outside of Petersburg where he's staying to observe one of his regiments before his Danish adventure.
Of course, and we talked about this earlier, but I do like their portrayal of this. He's observing a real regiment, but for them, it's still Peter playing with toy soldiers, which is basically what it is. Sorry, Peter. You're still behaving that way. And this is an interesting series of events because, it gets kicked off, sort of because it has to, like many different coups and uprisings throughout history, but it moves so quickly, and you sort of feel like at any point during this process, it could be stopped instantly, particularly if Peter learned about it and made decisive action. But, that's not what's going to happen.
The brother of Catherine's lover arrives just as Catherine is waking at 5 a.m. The time has come, he says. He quickly relays the night's event, skipping all the elaborate...
Yes, once again, honestly, I think everybody should learn from the Romans. If you're in this position of power as a king or an emperor or whatever, look back on the Romans who came before you and learn a little bit about preserving your position. Maybe don't... I mean, of course, you have to leave the capital, but be aware of the threats to you, and if they are threatening enough, maybe don't leave your capital, at least on a whim.
Dress of a high lady of the time, Catherine immediately rushes to the carriage. The horses are exhausted from the travel of the previous night, but as they are crawling down the road toward the capital, a farm wagon on its way to morning market passes. They stop it, and
Yeah. Saptha, that's an interesting comment. Catherine's son and successor, Paul, admire Peter III and change the entire line of succession for the Romanov dynasty, barring any females. I think Paul... I don't know too much about Paul. Most people don't know too much about Paul. He's an interesting fellow, though, because he was similar to his father in many ways, which is, I think, unfortunate for the position he held. But I do feel more sympathy, I think, for Paul than I did for Peter, because... And I don't know Peter's whole life, but, as Paul grew, his mother, Catherine, really barred him from a lot of positions of power, barred him from the authority that he should have been learning. I think partially because, Catherine was a very authoritarian ruler, and, both, I think, personally and politically, and she did not want her son in any way threatening her power, and also I imagine she saw Peter in him, and she didn't like that. And so I feel a little bit bad for Paul, because maybe he would have been just as bad, but I feel that he was probably pushed in a bad direction by his mother pushing him away from the halls of power and pushing him away from authority. But it's hard to say.
The Empress Consort pushes money into the farmer's hand. She has his 2 great farm horses tethered to her carriage right then and there, and they speed towards St. Petersburg. Out in the drill yard, Peter is making his small contingent of Holstein soldiers parade before him. A messenger brings news of the arrest of the guards and the possible conspiracy. Peter shrugs it off.
Oh, Peter, come on. See, that's the first strike against Peter here. Peter, as I said, to stop this, Peter needs quick and decisive action. And he could have done that at many points. Now, yeah, they are. Yeah, I didn't even realize that Light X7. They're doing the 24 thing. the sound effects, that's so funny. But yeah, Peter just needed to take some damn action. And once again, we're looking in retrospect. That's clear to us. It might not have been as clear to Peter, like he brushed off that warning. Maybe it really didn't seem like anything was wrong. But I'm willing to bet that Peter was also not very aware of what was going on around him and probably should have known better than how he was behaving here.
One by one, Catherine goes to the barracks of each of the guard units stationed in Petersburg. One by one, the regiments swear fealty to her in a jubilous tumult. Meanwhile, Peter is playing violin in his room. A man rushes in to tell him he has a message about happenings in the capital. Annoyed at the interruption, Peter tells the man to put it on the table. He'll read it later. He never does.
See, now this is strike 2. If you didn't think the first warning was a bad sign, at this point, if you have any awareness to you, you must realize that something is going wrong. Maybe it's not that important. Obviously, I wouldn't expect a coup if I was in his position, but I would think maybe something's happening, Something bad is going on. I'm getting several at this point, urgent messages from the capital. Maybe I should do something about that. But no, as always, Peter is too absorbed in whatever he's doing. Yeah, at this point, you mobilize any soldiers you can get, force a march to the capital. Exactly. That's exactly what you do. Consider the position you're in, Peter. But, he doesn't, unsurprisingly. We've watched this series a little bit. We know Peter. Is anyone surprised that he didn't behave appropriately in this scenario? Not really. So, yeah.
Surrounded by guards, a procession with Catherine at its center makes its way to the Cathedral of Our Lady Kazan, where the Archbishop of Novgorod pronounces her sovereign autocrat of Russia. Meanwhile, Peter orders a caravan of carriages assembled to take him and his guest back to Peterhof to have a feast.
Peter!
He forgets to order the usual cavalry escort.
Peter, he forgets to order the usual cavalry escort. He's not even trying at this point. Come on, Peter. It's a real shame that, his namesake is Peter the Great. He's named after one of the greatest Russian emperors. Probably the greatest Russian Tsar of all time. And this Peter is... one of the worst? I don't know. I mean, there's a couple of bad ones. Maybe not. Maybe one of the worst is unfair. We've saw that in reality, Peter's reign was more of a mixed bag. There was some good stuff, but he just really was not a great Tsar. And maybe one of the most, pathetic. Maybe you could call him that. One of the most immature. Yes, he's not Nicholas II bad, right? That's what I'm saying. There are worse Tsars than Peter. Peter is less actively bad than I think a lot of Tsars, but clearly he's really not capable or ready for this job. And he's named after Peter the Great, probably the Tsar who was most capable and ready for the job. Catherine and Peter to Octavian and Antony. Yeah. Antony... I mean, I've said a lot about Antony through our Historia Civilis reactions, and I have a lot of criticism for Antony. I agree, he was often oblivious to the changing political winds, though he had some good qualities, and he's obviously not as ignorant or immature as Peter. But there are some similarities there. Oh, Antony. Antony is capable at times, and he's... I mean, we saw his invasion of Parthia, but the whole reason he rose up through the ranks is because he was capable in terms of military affairs. So, it's not like he's a complete buffoon like Peter was, but sometimes you're just thinking, man, what is he doing? Yeah. And yeah, I'd probably agree, Daniel. I think Peter's probably a meh Tsar, mediocre. It's probably the best way to put it. As we saw, there were some good things. There were some bad things. And of course, the whole 7 Years' War was Peter turned it into a debacle, That should have been a big success for Russia. And Peter really ruined that. So overall, probably, mediocre to bad. But not one of the worst. Maybe one of the least impressive, because even some of the bad Tsars were probably more imposing than Peter was.
Catherine and an ever-growing mob process to the Winter Palace. There she meets with assembled members of the Senate and the Holy Synod, the highest religious council of Russia. She declares that out of love for Russia and the Orthodox faith, she had been moved to such action. That, at the urging of her subjects, against an emperor who imperiled them, she took the throne to deliver Russia from foreign powers and foreign religion.
Now, I mean, a lot of these enlightened monarchs, and Catherine is included with those, even though, I don't know, I think the term enlightened absolutist is kind of oxymoronic in some ways, and particularly with Catherine, but I think all of these enlightened monarchs, enlightened absolutists, were pretty damn good at PR. They were good at selling themselves to the public. I think Frederick was one of the best. Frederick the Great was really good at this. But Catherine, and of course, in many ways, she followed in the footsteps of Frederick, she was also good, and we're seeing that here. She's, of course, not going to frame this as some sort of blatant power grab. She's doing this for Russia, for the Orthodox religion, for Russia's people. Check, 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 brilliant. That's exactly how you want to sell it to, not really to the people. Let's be honest, the people themselves don't matter that much, but to these aristocrats and religious leaders, that's how you want to sell it. Yeah, Catherine did a quick snap poll. Peter's support was bottoming out, and she said, let me jump in. Let me jump in and, I'll take control. And clearly, Catherine was far more aware of the changing political circumstances than her husband was. She managed to build support among the powerful people of the capital, while Peter, at the same time, lost that support, and she used that to stage this coup, which was pretty bloodless, entirely bloodless maybe, I'm not sure. But, very non-violent compared to a lot of other coups, and very smooth compared to a lot of other coups.
Which, I mean, bold move, considering she herself was a foreigner who had come to Russia with a foreign religion, but hey, nobody was really sweating the details at the...
Yeah, and that's not really what matters, I mean, we can look at a lot of political leaders throughout history who are not who they claim to be, or are not the group that they advocate for. That's not what matters. What matters is how you sell yourself. And that's exactly what Catherine is doing.
The time. Meanwhile, Peter's group of revelers arrive at Peterhof, only to find no one there. Peter is furious. He storms through the house looking for Catherine. She spoiled his party. To one of his entourage, he screams in rage at her unthinking discourtesy. Didn't I always tell you she was capable of anything? A few of the more senior members of the party offer to head to St. Petersburg to see if they can find her. They had probably put 2 and 2 together by this point.
Yeah, and at this point, I mean, first off, Peter still has no idea what's going on. He's so oblivious, and his men probably know what's going on, and they're also not telling him. So you can see that, of course, Peter is, or I guess at this point was, Tsar of Russia. That commands a level of respect and loyalty. But Peter himself does not seem to command a lot of individual loyalty from almost anybody, which is a pretty bad spot to be in when you're facing a coup.
The embassy from Peter's company arrives. One of them begs Catherine not to take up arms against her husband. She takes him by the elbow and leads him to a balcony. Gesturing to the ecstatic crowd, she says, "Deliver your message to them." The small group of messengers all swear fealty to Catherine, or ask to be allowed to retire. Meanwhile, Peter has gotten his...
Smart move. Very smart move from those guys, I have to say. Sometimes you gotta know what you're up against, frankly. And sometimes it's okay to take a step back or switch to the other team.
First concrete news of all the goings-on from the crew of a firework barge that was sailing to Peterhof to provide the fireworks for his party. But all their information is still vague because they had left early in the morning, as they'd been ordered to go deliver the fireworks. Peter, enraged, orders word to be sent to Oranienbaum to get his Holstein regiment. He shouts that he would defend himself to the death. His men arrive and are...
Peter, it's way too late. It is way too late at this point. I mean, we've already seen he has had many chances to organize his troops and march on the capital and reassert himself. And all of those chances he has ignored. And only now, finally, when he's had all these chances, all these warnings, someone finally directly tells him what's happening, only now is he trying to make any sort of moves. Sorry, Peter, it's too late. You've already lost your throne.
Posted along the road to the capital, but no one thought to tell them that there might be a fight, so they only brought their wooden parade ground rifles.
Oh
a Russian
my God.
uniform is found for Peter, because he was still wearing the German one that he liked so much. His advisors gather around him. One counsels that he don the uniform, ride at full haste to the capital, and remind the people who they had sworn an oath to. Another recommends that he meet up with a larger contingent of the army 70 miles away and then march on St. Petersburg. A third recommends he flee to Germany. He does nothing. Men are sent to secure...
See, I mean, it's already pretty late for Peter to respond, but some of those are okay options. I mean, one of them is, Peter, you march right back in there and reassert yourself. So you could do that. And Light X Heaven says at this point, go to Moscow and try to raise troops there. Yeah, you basically move to another center of power like Moscow, try to gather your forces and march back in. That would be the one I would go with. I think that's the best option. The marching back into the capital and reasserting yourself is the more romantic option, but also extremely dangerous. It's not going to work because it's Peter. So, that's not going to work. Yeah, that's true, Daniel. I could definitely imagine Peter fleeing, west at this point, considering how much he loved Germany and all that German stuff. But I don't know. I don't even know what he was doing. Like, what was his mindset at this point? Was he, what he did seems like someone who's kind of resigned to their fate because it's such a stupid decision. But he might have just been that stupid. There were a couple of okay options. He was already in the danger zone, but he could have done a few things, and yet this is what he decides to do.
For a nearby island fortress. This fortress is still loyal. At least this was good news.
Sure, but get further away. A nearby island fortress. What? I just don't know what he's thinking of. It's just such a terrible idea.
Catherine had gotten the backing of the Synod, the people, the army, and the Senate without firing a shot. But there was one last thing she had to do. Peter had to formally abdicate. As was the right of the sovereign, she had taken on the rank of the colonel of the Preobrazhensky Guards. Borrowing pieces of a uniform from any of the men who seemed about her size, she strode out to meet her soldiers in the brilliant green of the Guards.
And that's pretty remarkable. We gotta remember the period we're talking about. Catherine's a woman, and of course we have powerful women in Russia, empresses, but, Catherine is taking on the role of a czar. She's she's leading her troops. This is a very traditional male role. In a pretty dang patriarchal society. But Catherine is a very powerful, intelligent, and probably intimidating person. She's never been held back by anything, so she's taking the role of the sovereign, which she feels she deserves, and she's rolling with it. It works, so there you go. But this is certainly an unusual sight for the period.
She would lead the final foray to capture Peter herself. As the march began, a young subaltern rushed up to give her his sword knot, the one piece her uniform yet lacked. This subaltern's name, by the way, was Gregory Potemkin.
Gregory Potemkin, Yes, keep an eye on young Potemkin. He will remain important throughout the story of Catherine the Great. Small fortress versus the whole of Russia. This is why I'm not sure why Peter decided to do this. It seems really defeatist to me, because clearly fleeing to this fortress just wasn't going to work.
Peter, meanwhile, chose to withdraw to the island fortress he had secured earlier in the evening. As his boat approached, the harbor was...
Potemkin. He's going to be like the internet. Not a big deal. Yeah, no need to worry about Potemkin. Extra history series on Eleanor of Aquitaine. I have seen that series. I'm going to be honest. I don't even know who Eleanor of Aquitaine is. But if it is a good one, I will certainly look into it. It has been added to the list. Eleanor is a baller. Okay. Expound. Oh, okay. Richard the Lionheart's mom. Okay. I obviously know Richard the Lionheart is. Very famous king. Well-liked. Well-remembered. Queen of France from 1137 to 1152. Queen of England. Oh, my. Those are a couple impressive titles. Queen of France, Queen of England, Duchess of Aquitaine. Wow. How about that? Okay. Sounds very interesting. Oh, okay. Add it to the list. I will check that out. Though, my list of potential series and videos to do is super long at this point. We've got a lot of stuff in the works, so it may be a long time before we get to it, but you have alerted me to it, and it sounds interesting. Wealthiest and most powerful women in Western Europe during the High Middle Ages. Oh, that sounds really interesting. Because the European Middle Ages is not my area of expertise at all. So I'd be interested to learn more. And also one of the most powerful women of that era. I'm really fascinated as to how she wielded her power. Yeah, that sounds interesting. And then Blue Flame King series on Justinian. Yeah. Yeah, I definitely want to do the series on Justinian, and I've wanted to do it for a while. That's more in my wheelhouse. You know, we did the series on Belisarius, and I know a bit about Justinian. And as you mentioned, right now we're doing Khosrow, and, you know, it's sort of natural to do Justinian. So, yeah, we'll probably get to Justinian at some point. I don't know when. Like I said, I've got a lot of stuff in the works. We've got videos scheduled quite a bit in the future. But I would definitely like to do more Justinian content, because he's interesting, and I have a lot to say about Justinian. But if you watch the rest of the Khosrow series, which I finished filming and will be released in the coming weeks, I do say a lot of things about Justinian. This also happened with her being imprisoned for years. My goodness. Heir to the Duchy of Aquitaine, big and powerful chunk of France. Wow, okay. Interesting. Yeah. So, we'll definitely get to Justinian at some point. Well, maybe not soon, but maybe relatively soon. And then, y'all are selling me on this Eleanor of Aquitaine series, so I will definitely try and get to that at some point soonish. She was a baddie. Yeah, okay, Roman, that's a descriptor. Yeah, Justinian's pretty cool. Justinian is a fascinating character. I mean, we're doing a series on Khosrow right now, and I think, in my opinion, Justinian and Khosrow run parallel to each other. They're similar in many ways, and, you know, Justinian is also one of the few figures from Byzantine history that people are actually familiar with, so that's also good. But we have already covered Justinian a little bit. I mean, we did Belisarius, and we talked about Justinian a lot through that, obviously. And like I said, the Khosrow series, which is ongoing, you know, particularly in the latter episodes, I talk a lot about Justinian. But I would still like to do an independent series on him. He's a fascinating fellow. And I always enjoy doing Byzantine history, because it's a bit niche, but it's more of a popular niche. I saw that, I think it was Kings and Generals recently released like a pretty long video. It's like an hour and a half, 2 hours or something, on Byzantine Reconquista. And I was like, ooh, fascinating. Add that to the list. The list is long. The list is very long. But okay. Eleanor and Justinian, alongside two seemingly very interesting historical characters. Interesting. Okay, and Catherine the Great, which is what we're on right now. Another fascinating character. So, let's see what Catherine's up to. Well, she's currently up to becoming the Empress of Russia.
Closed off to him. He shouted to the men in the fort, "Do you not know me? I'm your emperor." To which the reply came, "We no longer have an emperor."
Peter getting dunked on, as always. Yeah, well, my list can't be longer than the Code of Justinian. The Fourth Crusade by Kings and Generals, added to the list. Kings and Generals, Fourth Crusade. Yeah, that's another topic that I don't know too much about. We did part of a series on the First Crusade, which was interesting. And obviously, I have some general knowledge on the Byzantine Empire. But the rest of the Crusades are really something I don't know too much about. But I'm very interested in them. They seem like fascinating occurrences. And I'm also very interested in how they play into Byzantine history. Yeah, Daniel, this is one big list. We just got another edition. How did Caesar Augustus transform Rome? I did say earlier in this broadcast that I would like to do more Augustus content. So I would check that out. Also, I don't know if any of you have watched, I think, Overly Sarcastic Productions has at least one video on Augustus, the Age of Augustus. Plus they have, I think it's like Augustus's Marble City. I don't know if you guys have watched that, but it sounds interesting, and I've enjoyed their videos so far. So I was gonna do that one as well. Yeah, okay. Yeah, well, I did OSP's videos on, Roman Empire and Roman Republic re-summarized, and I loved those. Those are fantastic. So I reckon they probably do a good job on Augustus, too. Yes, and Augustus forced everybody to use the names Caesar and Augustus, which they did. Admiral Yi. Wow. A lot of you seem to like Admiral Yi. I don't know who that is, but it seems to be well liked. So that's another one added to the list. Korea, man, so much different history. Now Korean history. I'm super shaky on Korean history. Single-handedly stopped the Japanese invasion of Korea. My goodness, what time period are we talking about here? I need some framing. He's the only admiral on Nelson's level. Wow, that's quite an endorsement. Just after the Sengoku die. Okay. Yeah, no, I will definitely check that out as well. My knowledge on Admiral Yi, as you can tell, is literally like 0. So that would be a learning series. That's what I call them. But I'm totally willing to do that. It sounds interesting. Yeah, it sounds interesting. I'll definitely add that to the list. Wow. Yeah, we're getting some high praise for Admiral Yi. We might get to that sooner than some of the other stuff, because I like to keep a bit of variety on the channel. And so, like we do a lot of Roman history. I don't like to do too much Roman history at one time. So I feel like slipping the Admiral Yi series in there at some point would be nice. So maybe we'll do that. We'll do that when I'm looking for some variety, because sometimes I want to do something that I haven't done before, just to try something new, gauge the audience reaction, and it sounds like you guys really like this series, so yeah, we might do that at some point soonish. Though, like I said, we've got a lot on our plate. Like, we're starting next week our series on Hannibal. I think it's next week. Actually, it might be the week after that. Let me see how I've got this scheduled out. No, it's next week. Yeah, so next week we have our first Hannibal video, and we'll be doing History Marches series on Hannibal, which I'm excited about. That one will probably take a while. It's a relatively long series. After Yi's death, he was hailed as a god of war. My goodness. Deified after your death. Pretty impressive. Yeah, Hannibal's gonna be good. I've only filmed part 1, which is going up next week. I'm gonna start filming the rest soon. But that's gonna be a really exciting one. I like it because it's one that I know a bit about. I can talk a bit about Hannibal, general Roman history, but I've got a lot to learn. All of Hannibal's conquests, his accomplishments, his defeat at the end. There's a lot to Hannibal, and he's a really fascinating character. As Lydex Heaven puts it, every Roman's boogeyman. Are there any good videos there about Ming Taizu? You're going to have to remind me, or just tell me who that is, Roman. I don't even know if I know Ming Taizu. Maybe you've mentioned him before. So I don't know if there's good videos there about him. Ming Taizu. Ah, okay. First emperor of the Ming Dynasty. Interesting. Okay. I'm sure there's some videos on the Ming Dynasty. Massive purges because of paranoia. Well, you know, any great emperor. Extra history series on Genghis Khan. Interesting. Yeah, there's a lot of Mongol content out there. I haven't gotten into any of it. I think Kings and Generals has a series on the Mongols. There's quite a lot of it. More in his life than just pillage and slaughter. Quite tragic. Really, really interesting. Yeah, I don't know much about Genghis Khan. I mean, I know what's commonly known, the pillage and slaughter. But to learn a little bit more about his life, that does sound interesting. All right, back to back to Catherine and Peter briefly. Extra history, War of the Bucket. Okay.
Long live Empress Catherine II. In the time between him sending his man to secure the fort and him choosing to finally go there, the top admiral of the Navy had sworn allegiance to the new empress and headed to the fort to take over its command personally. Peter fled into his cabin to hide. When he returned to Peterhof, he dismissed everyone and then went to his room.
Oh, Peter. And yes, Shad, last stream, the first stream I did, we did a brief reaction, but most of that stream was talking about history and listing recommendations. This is one of the reasons why the recommendation list is so long, because, y'all recommended many good series last time, which I'm very pleased about. I mean, I always like to have more content to react to. It's a good problem to have, but of course what it means is that I have to then sort through it and decide what I'm going to do. So, I mean, if I took my entire recommendation list and planned out all the reactions, I post one main video every 2 days. Like, honestly, my entire list would probably take me more than a year to get to. Honestly, probably years. I've got so much content to post. So I'm never ever going to get to all of it. I have to prioritize and, choose what people are interested in and what I want to do. Yeah. Well, invading Russia from the west is interesting. Obviously, we have a couple of examples of that being failed. Napoleon, Hitler. But Russia itself was also, or Russian leadership was also always obsessed with invasion from the west. I mean, this is one of the reasons why they were always trying to conquer their western neighbors to a certain point, is that they were always afraid of invasion and encroachment from the west. Which, I mean, that's where most of the invasion came from, but it also ended up not being successful.
Refusing to speak to his staff. Then he composed a letter to Catherine, apologizing for his bad behavior and offering to share the throne with her.
Share the throne? Peter, it is way too late for that. She's already been sworn in as the support of the capital's main religious and political figures, and has the support of the army and the navy, or at least the main admiral. So, I don't think we're getting a power-sharing agreement.
At first light, Catherine receives Peter's letter. She is unimpressed. A few hours later, she receives another letter offering to abdicate if he could just go back to Holstein. She accepts. He writes an abject abdication statement detailing how unfit he is to rule. Needless to say, a few weeks later, he wound up dead in a drunken brawl that was probably a cleverly disguised assassination.
Yep.
And his idol, the man he kept telling himself he was equal to, Frederick the Great, of the affair, Frederick merely said he allowed himself to be dethroned like a child being sent to bed.
Yeah. I mean, Peter was a simp for Frederick the Great, but he just did not live up to Frederick's image in the slightest. So Frederick didn't care about him at all. And, you know, he was murdered, and it was most likely an assassination. I find it extremely, you know, unbelievable that he wasn't murdered on purpose in some way. I think there's two possibilities here. Either Catherine directly ordered the assassination, which is definitely a possibility, or it's one of those situations where maybe Catherine didn't order it, but everybody knows that this is what Catherine wants, and so one of her subordinates or someone who wanted to gain her favor murders Peter. Not on the direct orders from Catherine, but, you know, sort of due to her influence. This is a trick that Vladimir Putin loves to use, by the way. But basically, I think she was probably involved in some way.
And while Catherine probably had nothing to do with Peter being killed, she did pardon his killers.
Right, and this is why it may have been a direct assassination that was ordered. I think more likely it was the latter option that I talked about. And I think one of the pieces of evidence is that she pardoned the killers, right? Is very suspicious.
As his death freed her up to rule without the worry that someone would try and form a counter-rebellion around him. And rule she did, rapidly reversing almost all of Peter's policies. As Russian forces were literally on the verge of engaging with Denmark, riders arrived with Catherine's orders to return home.
God damn. And I mean, we gotta remember, you know, we're talking about a different time period. Communication was not instant or even fast. And so we have examples of battles or wars continuing even after they were supposed to end. I mean, I think of, as an American, a prominent example is the Battle of New Orleans with Andrew Jackson, right? At that point, the War of 1812 was already over. Britain and the United States had signed a peace deal. But news hadn't gotten to New Orleans at that point, and so the Brits and the Americans fought this big battle that was a big victory for the Americans, and more, maybe importantly, a big victory for the career of Andrew Jackson, even though the war was technically over at that point. Should have used smoke signals instead. Yes, use all those Lord of the Rings fires set up throughout Europe that we used to communicate with each other.
In fact, that was the order to all the Russian troops in Europe. She was going to begin an era of neutrality, where Russian troops fought on neither side of the 7 Years' War, and for this, the army was forever grateful. The church, on the other hand, was more complex. She put a temporary moratorium on Peter's order to secularize all church land.
And, I mean, of course, this is secularizing and taking church lands is a pretty radical move, but not an uncommon one. I mean, this is something that, of course, we saw during the French Revolution, and everyone freaked out about it, but throughout Europe, a lot of monarchs, including Catholic monarchs, I think of Joseph in Austria, they wanted to limit the power of the church, and they would take some church lands, or at least try to gain some revenue for the church, from the church. All right, well, thank you for hopping onto the stream, Shad. It's 2 a.m. where you're at, so definitely go to bed at this point. That's probably a smart decision, but I appreciate you stopping in. A lot of good, comments today, so, thanks for showing up. Make sure to get some sleep at this point.
But Catherine was intent on being an informed ruler, And as reports came into her every day, one thing became more and more clear. Russia was broke. Grain prices were soaring, the treasury was filled with IOUs.
Yep, Russia was broke, and as I talked about earlier, this was true for a lot of European powers following the 7 Years' War. A lot of countries were totally broke. Thank you, Shad. I really appreciate that. I'm glad you enjoyed the videos. And yeah, I mean, engage however you're comfortable, but I'd love to see comments from you. You know, you seem to have some good contributions. So yeah, that'd be interesting. But yeah, thanks for appreciating the channel. I'm glad you enjoy.
Ending all the wars would help, but not seeing the reparations which might have been expected with a decisive victory, Russia was penniless and without any recourse to credit. And easily 1/10 of all the wealth of Russia was locked up in church land.
Yeah, join the dark side of the comment section. I can guarantee you Light X Heaven will be waiting, prowling the comment section, waiting to engage, in a very friendly way.
Wealth that her government needed. After a long back and forth with the Synod about the morality of a church which owned so much property but didn't help with the temporal affairs like charity and education, and with a few threats thrown in, Catherine was able to cow them. All church property became state property. More than 1 million church serfs became peasants, which meant they now had to pay tax.
Yeah, seizing wealth from rich churches, classic move. Exactly. This is a very classic move. Now, the way the French revolutionaries did it was certainly radical, but I feel like people often don't understand the context around this move, that it was more common than people realize. Like I was saying, particularly after the 7 Years' War, there was a big movement against churches who were extremely wealthy, a big movement against monasteries in particular. I think of Joseph in Austria, and his mother, even though she was a devout Catholic, they were both Catholic, she was very devout, you know, they both, particularly Joseph, took a stand against monasteries, which were beginning to be seen as institutions that just hoarded a lot of wealth and didn't actually produce anything. And following the 7 Years' War, these countries that were broke and needed more tax revenue, they wanted these assets being put towards something productive. And so there was a lot of legislation against monasteries and churches. A lot of seizure of wealth from these places. A lot of monasteries were straight up shut down. And remember, we're talking about very Catholic Austria with very Catholic monarchs. So this was not an uncommon thing at all. One of our kings decided to follow Henry's lead, just change the state religion to Lutheranism in order to have a justification to seize the church wealth. Yeah. You know, this was not an uncommon thing in many contexts. You know, we see a lot of examples of this, but particularly after the 7 Years' War. Like I've said throughout this series, the 7 Years' War was incredibly influential, and its aftermath really shaped the whole world, but particularly Europe and the Americas.
And all church officials became employees of the state. And this shows the strength of Catherine.
I mean, this is also what the French revolutionaries did. They wanted all priests in France to become employees of the state, but it was a lot more controversial, of course, because the French revolutionaries were a lot more anti-Catholic, anti-religious, a lot more secular, and also a lot, like, they just wholly seized church land and started to parcel it out to the highest bidder. Well, yes, we also have the cult of the supreme being. You know, reason held up as a god. There were a couple of odd cults that emerged at the time. But, you know, what they did was far more radical, far more irreligious, and far more unacceptable to religious people and the church as a whole, compared to something like this, or what happened in Austria, say.
Where Peter lost one of the great pillars of the Russian state, and arguably his throne, for his policy, Catherine's iron will and careful management of the other elements of power allowed her to drag in this vast source of government revenue. But in doing so, it also brought up the other great issue for Catherine: serfs. Because serfs in Russia were...
Oh, we are getting to serfs, huh? Man, not to give too much of a spoiler, but serfdom will continue to be a, well, I would view it as a problem that Russia would have to face decades in its future. And even after serfdom was ended, there were still a lot of issues. But yes, serfdom, one of the most important institutions of Russia at this point. Yes, the Pugachev Rebellion. Yes. I wonder if we're going to cover that. I'm not exactly sure what year it occurred, but that was a very fascinating uprising. But yeah, serfdom. Oh my.
Slaves. They could be bought and sold, abused with no rights over their own bodies. They could be gambled away or traded. They had no choice but to work the vocation their master chose for them, and they couldn't move or leave the land that they were bound to.
Yeah, and there's sometimes conversations on, like, how similar was serfdom to slavery, blah, blah, blah. I don't know if it really matters. Like, we can describe both institutions separately, but if we look at serfdom, it's an institution which strips autonomy away from the people who are serfs. Your control over your own body and your own life is diminished greatly and put into the hands of these landowners, right? So, however close it is to slavery, and also the thing is, slavery has been practiced different ways throughout history. But when people say slavery, they think of basically American chattel slavery. And when I say American, I don't necessarily mean United States. I mean, like, chattel slavery as it was practiced primarily in the Americas. But also the United States is probably the best example of this. Though, Brazil did keep it for even longer. But, so, I don't feel the need to be like, compare chattel slavery to serfdom. Like, there's no point. Both are these horrible, horrible institutions. Yeah, that's basically it. Slaves are considered forms of property owned by other people, and serfs are bound to the land, right? These are the distinctions. But I feel no need to compare in terms of, like, how bad they are. Like, I'm not in the game of comparing bad things to each other and saying, well, this was bad, but this was more bad. It doesn't seem productive to me. But yes, that is the distinction between serfdom and slavery. But, clearly, the serfs had a bad lot. And this will become a bigger problem in Russia as the years go on. There will be more, as we head into the late 1700s, early 1800s, there will be more advocacy against the institution of serfdom. As more aristocrats in Russia move towards liberalism, particularly following the Napoleonic Wars, and a small, very small middle class begins to develop that is itself relatively liberal, there will be more people who find serfdom abhorrent as an institution. At this point, there's not a ton of anti-serfdom activism, but it is still clearly a problem, and it can lead to other problems like rebellions, as Light X Heaven mentioned. So,
And with burgeoning industrial revolution, there came to be a new kind of serf. A serf not owned by a master, but owned by a corporation, many of whom were employed by the great mining enterprises of the Urals.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people don't know this, but, we think about, say, let's use American slavery as an example. We think about, slaves working on plantations, and then we also think about, like, house slaves. Enslaved people who worked inside the houses of their masters. But I think what people don't know is that, look, the American South did not industrialize nearly to the level of the North, or nearly as fast, I should say, but there was industrialization happening. And for a while, slaves in an American context would often be loaned out to mines or factories in order to work in those institutions, or they would be owned by those mining companies, or whoever owned the company, or whoever owned the factory. It's a really fascinating thing to study. There was this system of loaning out slaves, and this was actually one of the reasons why insurance was so popular. Insurance was always popular for slaves. They were considered a form of property, but insurance was particularly important if you were going to loan out, your slave to go work at a factory, then you needed insurance. So, I mean, truly an abhorrent, disgusting system. But it is really interesting how it sort of intertwined with growing industry in the South. And I think this is pretty overlooked. Like, you don't hear many people talking about this kind of stuff because of sort of the stereotypical image of the, plantation, right? And how the South was not industrialized. And that is still generally true. The vast majority of slaves worked on plantations, and the South wasn't that industrialized. But, there's nuances there. It's interesting.
And in these mines, life was ugly, brutish, and short. Because they were chattel, men were literally worked
Bit of a Hobbesian perspective.
to death,
But it probably actually was ugly, brutish, and short.
beaten when they paused for a moment in their labor. This treatment caused riots and strikes that would eventually lead to the largest peasant revolt in Russian history.
Ah, there we
So
go.
join us next time for the plight of the serfs.
Oh, interesting. I guess we're going to talk about it in part 4. Very fascinating.
With-
Okay, so Catherine the Great, part 4. Reforms, Rebellion, and Greatness. Well, she is called Catherine the Great. I'm curious to see how many episodes are in this series. My goodness, 6. It's a longer one. We might get to all of it today. We also might not. We've already been going for almost 2 hours, and we've done... Wait a minute. We've been going for 2 hours, and we skipped through the first one, and then we watched 2 parts that are each 10 minutes. Some would say we are going through at a relatively slow pace. So many greats in history. This is true. We have a lot of greats throughout history. We also have a scale of greats. It's interesting. We have some greats who are definitely more great than other greats. But anyway, part 4, Reforms, Rebellion, and Greatness. We're now seeing the emergence of another great.
With the war in Europe settled and the church finally under her control, Catherine could at last focus on her great project, the law.
Haha. Very funny.
In her spare time, while not getting distracted by things
Jeez, is filled with puns. The law, great, spare. My goodness. And then there were those greats that didn't get great in their name. That's true. No, I mean, there are a lot of great figures throughout history who are not known as the great.
like getting an ex-lover elected the puppet king
But honestly, the great, that's kind of cliche, right? I feel like even if I was a great, I'd want maybe a more unique nickname or known as something a little more specific to me. I mean, having the great moniker, that's certainly impressive, but there's a lot of people who have the moniker of the great.
of Poland, or corresponding with Voltaire, Catherine focused on
Corresponding with Voltaire. I don't know if we're going to go into this more, but following in the footsteps of another great, Frederick, Catherine was also this sort of enlightened monarch, right? And specifically following in the footsteps of Frederick, I'm of the opinion that Frederick the Great really established this sort of archetypical enlightened monarch, enlightened absolutist, and Catherine was very much following in that model. And so, like Frederick, she corresponded with Voltaire. Frederick corresponded a lot with Voltaire, and there's some speculation that, I mean, they were close. There was some speculation that they were more than close, right? If you catch my drift. They had a bit of a quarrel at one point and fell out, but I don't know the veracity of these claims. But like Frederick, Catherine corresponded with a lot of Enlightenment figures. Voltaire was getting a bit old at this point, though he would be around for a while. I know specifically she corresponded with Denis Diderot. I know a bit about Diderot. I think he's a fascinating character. That they had some correspondence. Diderot would go to Russia to visit Catherine, though unlike a lot of his contemporaries, Diderot was critical of Catherine's authoritarianism. Diderot was someone who did feel that the title enlightened absolutist or enlightened despot was oxymoronic, which someone like Voltaire didn't. Voltaire loved a good enlightened monarch. He felt like, if you could implement Enlightenment policy in an authoritarian manner, that was completely fine. Diderot disagreed. That's why William stands out to so many people. William the Great, true.
Writing the Nakaz, a massive set of guidelines for how to rewrite the laws of the land. These weren't laws, mind you, but rather guidelines on how to make...
But yeah, William the Great or William the Conqueror? William the Conqueror is a pretty cool name. That's what I'm saying. If I was some sort of great figure throughout history, I'd be like, give me some specific cool name. Federico da Montefeltro. Maybe I'm exposing myself here, but I really don't recognize that name. Federico da Montefeltro. Right, okay. So when I talk about an enlightened despot, if we're looking at the literature, I specifically mean a phenomenon that began in the 18th century, where we have these authoritarian leaders who were specifically influenced by the Enlightenment intellectual movement. It's kind of complicated because the word enlightened refers to both the Enlightenment and just the general concept of being enlightened. So when I talk about an enlightened monarch, I mean an Enlightenment monarch, someone influenced by the Enlightenment intellectual movement of the long 18th century, right? But you make a good point, Strobex, which is that there were a lot of other leaders throughout history who were influenced by contemporary philosophy, humanism, there were other enlightenments throughout the world, throughout history. So yeah, that's an interesting point. But I'm specifically talking about, this phenomenon of the Enlightenment monarch. I guess that's probably a little bit more clear, referencing the European Enlightenment of the era. And yes, good point, Light X Heaven. Your name becomes a title. Caesar/Augustus, both of them. That's pretty cool. OSP's video on Alexander the Great. Okay. Like I said, I enjoy OSP's content, and I want to watch more of it. Hello, Trevor. Nice of you to stop in. You're here to experience some beautiful history with us. All right.
Laws, because Catherine had a novel idea. She would bring together representatives of her people and ask them what problems they faced that needed fixing before she actually went about making new laws. And so she assembled representatives from every free class, region, and religion in her empire.
And of course, this is what we would see at/before the outset of the French Revolution. The exact same thing. The Estates General was called, and I'm blanking on what the name of these were. Light X Heaven might know, because he's very knowledgeable. But they sent out, basically every municipality or village or whatever would send in their complaints to the assembly. Okay, yeah, this is the issue. This is the problem. And then the idea was to, consult with those complaints and determine them at a national level. Of course, what happened was very different. Everything sort of spiraled out of control, and then we have the revolution. But, this is an interesting concept.
To come together and discuss what laws needed to be made.
Though remember, don't be mistaken, some people are. This is not democratic in any sense of the word. Catherine still has ultimate control over these laws, what is going to be passed, how it's going to be implemented. This is Catherine consulting with her people, right? There is some spirit of popular empowerment there, at least a bit, but I think it's worth keeping in mind because Catherine is known as this enlightened despot, right? A lot of people highlight the enlightened part and forget the despot part. Catherine was certainly influenced to some extent by Enlightenment thought, but that did not extend to bringing any sort of political power to the people, at least in any significant way. She was an authoritarian. She held onto her power very tightly.
And in some ways, this was incredibly inclusive. She had representatives who were Cossacks, representatives who were Muslims, even representatives who were Buddhists. But there was...
Yeah, exactly. Surely the serfs were well represented by their landowners in this assembly. They're pointing out how representative this assembly was. In other ways, it was not very representative. And I think also, I guess I don't have an issue necessarily with how they're presenting it, but I think people might get the wrong idea from this. To a lot of people, I think seeing this list would seem like, wow, this is a super modern representation, you know? This is diverse. No. Don't get the wrong idea. This is more based on some idea of empire building, as in empires expand and they integrate groups into their empire, and, you know, if you want to eliminate all other groups, you're going to have a hard time expanding. And so you have to give some concessions to different religious and ethnic groups as you go. And so this is not some modern idea of diversity or toleration. This is more based on that more medieval or ancient idea of expanding a multi-ethnic empire, like the Romans, you know? So that's more what they're going for here, right?
Was one group that was left out. That whole free part in free class meant that there would be no serfs.
Yeah, and it's worth remembering that at this point, the Russian Empire is incredibly rural. I don't know the percentages, but the vast, vast majority of Russia is going to be peasants, and the majority of those peasants are going to be serfs.
After all, the serfs' owners could look after their interests, right? But no serfs meant that 9/10 of the empire went unrepresented.
There you go, 90%. So even though in some ways this assembly was representative, clearly it's not representative in any sort of legitimate democratic way. You're excluding 90% of the empire.
And as for the representatives of the 1/10 who did show up for her great assembly on laws, they were utterly unprepared for it. There really hadn't been much involvement in government in Russia up to this point, and truth be told, many of the people involved held at least some suspicion that this was a trick or some sort of loyalty test. For the first of...
And, I mean, to be fair, they're presenting them as like these bumbling fools here, like, wow, they don't even know how to attend an assembly, but hey, can you blame them? They're living under this intensely autocratic system. I mean, Russia is really one of the most autocratic governments at this time, and it will continue to be extremely autocratic. So I think it's kind of legitimate for them to be afraid that some sort of trick is being pulled on them. You know, this concept is foreign to them. Yeah, well, that's true. The serfs were seen as barely human, you know, if human at all. And so if you hold that perspective, which most of the Russian elite would have, then this would be quite a representative assembly. That's exactly right, Light Heaven.
Many meetings, they debated what honorific to award Catherine. If you are wondering, the Great just narrowly beat out All-Wise Mother of the Fatherland.
Wow.
Catherine found this infuriating. Did they not understand that she had called them here to help her figure out what laws to make?
No, they literally don't understand that. And I get it. And here we're talking about the Nakaz, which is Catherine's, code of laws that she would produce. I imagine we're going to talk about the contents a little more, later or right now.
Not to just give her titles? Well, no. In fact, a fair number of them couldn't even read the guidelines she gave them, and even fewer really understood the heavy Enlightenment philosophy which formed the basis of the Nakaz.
Okay. Yeah, yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. I don't necessarily blame these people for being confused. So, we get to the Nakaz. They said the heavy Enlightenment foundation. This is where I quibble. I don't know how heavy it was. Now, look, okay. This is where my critiques of Catherine sort of come into play. And this is very not surface level, right? so most people won't even like get this. But Catherine was certainly influenced by the Enlightenment. I mean, she corresponded with Enlightenment thinkers. She was explicitly influenced by them. She would tell you that. But I think, and you know, some people have presented the Nakaz as like this enlightened guideline, this enlightened series of laws that really represented the movement. I don't really see it like that. I see it as Catherine more just trying to reorganize and, frankly, organize Russia, organize the government, organize Russian law, which that is not a new enlightened idea. That's a very old idea. And Catherine makes very clear in the Nakaz that she is maintaining her autocratic authority as the head of the Russian state. She explicitly talks about how, ruling over a state like this, it's impossible for me not to be autocratic. The Enlightenment, some Enlightenment thinkers might prefer some sort of republic or constitutional monarchy or whatever, but I am the Tsar of Russia, and in order to govern this country, I need full authority. Full authority. And she makes that really, really clear. So sometimes I think people's framing of this is really off. Nakaz was a little more than an attempt to replace the old Muscovite laws with a modern law code. Yeah, that's exactly right. I agree. And it was, Catherine, it was pretty fancy. And, once again, she did good PR. She pushed it out to everybody. And she was definitely influenced by the Enlightenment. That's undeniable. But I agree with that interpretation more, Light X Heaven. What you're saying is more the truth than it being some enlightened law code. So yeah, I think that you're exactly right on that. Not to mention that, I mean, as Catherine grew older, particularly following the French Revolution, she would grow further and further separated from any Enlightenment values she held. She would revoke a lot of the policy that was clearly influenced by the Enlightenment. So I just think it's a lot more complicated than people think. And, something interesting is that when Denis Diderot, a prominent Enlightenment philosopher, he spearheaded the Encyclopedia, for those who may be somewhat familiar. When Diderot went to visit her, they had a lot of conversations which were more like debates, and Diderot was often pretty frank with her. Though Diderot wrote a book, basically, or a pamphlet that was called Observations on the Nakaz, and he didn't share that with her. I believe she only read it after he was dead, and she wasn't happy because Diderot was incredibly critical of the Nakaz, and he had a similar perspective to you, Light X Heaven, which he felt that the Nakaz was more about strengthening the monarchy. It wasn't about bringing any sort of enlightenment to Russia. It was about strengthening Catherine's position as this autocratic figure, and Diderot was really critical of that. Diderot was one of those people who felt that the idea of an enlightened absolutist didn't work. You cannot be enlightened and an absolute despot. Yep, there is no true sovereign except the nation. There can be no true legislator except the people. Diderot. There we go. And to be clear, not all Enlightenment thinkers agreed with that. Voltaire was incredibly elitist. Voltaire loved these enlightened despots. So, it's not like this was an idea held by all Enlightenment thinkers, but Diderot in particular was really critical of this sort of thing. I'm really fascinated by Diderot. I'm kind of a Diderot fan. He was a man of his time. Not that everything he said was great, but I think that he had a really interesting perspective, particularly compared to a lot of his contemporaries. Yeah. I mean, I do think there were obviously different national enlightenments, and then we have the European Enlightenment as a whole. I think the Russian Enlightenment was particularly separate. It was also not very strong compared to a lot of the other Enlightenments. Not to mention, it was extremely top-down. The Russian Enlightenment was very much spearheaded by Catherine. And when there was some independent thought emerging, Catherine made sure to crush it, you know? So, yeah, I agree with that point.
Which meant that getting anything useful from them was like pulling teeth. The merchants wanted the rights of nobles. The nobles wanted to be able to engage in commerce as merchants. And the peasants mostly gave very specific complaints about how that jerk Boris from the next village over keeps letting his cows trample my fence.
And this is true for the Estates General, so this is not like a Russia-specific thing. When the Estates General happened, and I mentioned how all these villages and all these groups sent in their complaints, the French peasants also sent in very specific complaints, like, hey, this fence is broken, or this bridge in our town needs to be fixed. But, you know, I feel like they're kind of portraying them as like idiots or buffoons, but you gotta remember the context within which they were living. This was a completely foreign concept to them. And even with the nobles and the merchants, you know, they're not thinking of any sort of, this is not any sort of representative institution. By the way, Catherine isn't thinking that either. They're thinking that they're just trying to help themselves as much as possible. So I think what they're saying and the way they're approaching this makes sense considering what they know.
Can we make a law about that? Catherine was an autocrat at heart. She believed in absolutism, but she wanted data. She felt that an autocrat should rule with knowledge and understanding, but knowledge and understanding...
Yes, I think that's a fair way to put it. She was an autocrat. She wanted full and complete power, but she wanted to be informed, you know? She didn't want to rule blindly. She wanted to know what was going on. She wanted data. So that's true.
Were in short supply in these meetings. Finally, after much frustration, the whole affair was called off. Foreign events had become more pressing. Remember when I mentioned that Catherine had put a puppet on the Polish throne? Well, she'd been having that puppet do things that were more and more clearly against the best interest of the Poles. The Polish people finally rebelled, and the Russian army was sent in to put the rebellion down. But in doing so, a Russian regiment chased fleeing Polish insurgents into Ottoman territory. The French had been leaning on the Ottomans to get into the Polish conflict for some time, and this seemed like just the excuse. So
Sweden was a bit unique in Europe as the peasants were represented by the parliament, wealthy peasants, alongside the clergy, nobility, and merchant classes. Yeah, that's an interesting setup. That's fascinating. Though I will say, I think there's some idea that like medieval Europe into early modern Europe was just a bunch of autocrats. You know, these states ruled by these autocratic kings. But as we know, throughout a lot of the Middle Ages into this period, a lot of kings were not that powerful, you know? It was actually only in this time period with people like Louis XIV when a lot of monarchs began to centralize power. And they would take a lot of the power that their nobles had once held. Now, Russia is a bit unique in that the Russian Tsar was probably the most autocratic position in all of Europe. It was insanely powerful. Really a lot more than most other European monarchies. It relied a lot less on subordinates to get things done. It really held an amazing amount of power, and Peter the Great really intensified that power. I think following in, similar to Louis XIV in many ways. Until the age of absolutism, kings were heavily dependent on their feudal vassals. Exactly. The French kings used to be incredibly weak. Yeah, this is exactly the point I'm making. And so, there was actually a surprising amount of these councils or representative institutions throughout Europe. Now, to be clear, most of these representative institutions, parliaments, councils, whatever, were only representative of the nobility. But, you know, the king was restrained in some ways. And some of these representative institutions, Light X Heaven brings up Sweden as an example. I'm not very familiar with it, but some of these institutions also included other groups to a certain extent, usually not much. And some of these institutions, we can look at, say, the British Parliament, would evolve over time to include non-noble groups. So it's a lot more of a complex and nuanced situation than if you're just thinking of, oh yeah, autocratic kings with all the power. A lot more complicated than that. And this absolute power, which no power is actually absolute, really began to develop in this age of absolutism with people like Louis XIV. He's the most popular example, and he's the most popular example for a reason.
The Ottomans locked up the Russian ambassador and went to war. This turned out to be a poor decision on the Ottomans' part. Once seen as near equals, the Russians belied expectations and delivered the Ottomans a series of crushing defeats.
The Ottomans, you know, I mean, I'm going to say I like the Ottoman Empire, not in the sense that I, like, agree with it or whatever. I just mean I think it's interesting, right? I think the Ottoman Empire is a fascinating empire. It was so powerful at one point, but it's already at this point entered into its decline, and that decline will continue, I mean, until the 20th century, though by then it will have lost the vast majority of its territory. The Ottomans are just a really fascinating empire. I mean, this Islamic empire on the edge of Europe that, you know, the Ottomans controlled, at one point, you know, the entire Middle East, North Africa, a lot of territory. But the Ottomans were always really focused westward, you know? I mean, their capital was Constantinople, which would become Istanbul. Unlike a lot of other Islamic empires whose capital was in the Middle East, you know, the Ottomans were westward looking. And of course, they had, you know, they conquered to the east and they had enemies to deal with in the east. But the Ottomans were really kind of obsessed with moving westwards, conquering further into Europe, conquering Eastern Europe and Central Europe. So it was really, really interesting influence. And at one point, it really did look like they would sweep through a lot of Eastern and Central Europe. They were a massive threat. To the list. I will add that to the list. But yeah, you're exactly right. I think the Ottoman Empire is greatly underestimated, and a lot of people don't recognize the influence they had on Europe. That is exactly right. And that's why I find the Ottomans so fascinating. I mean, I find a lot of stuff. First off, I just find the Balkans as a region fascinating. Balkans and, like, Anatolia, I guess. And these empires, like the Byzantine Empire and the Ottoman Empire, that I feel are super underestimated and don't get enough talk about them, despite their influence. So, yeah, I find that kind of stuff really interesting.
On land, the Russian forces, led in small part by one Grigory Potemkin,
Hey, there's Potemkin, already popping up again.
seemed invincible. And at sea, where the Turks thought themselves to be unopposed because the Russians had no port on the Black Sea, the Russians conceived of a bold plan to take the Balkans.
Yep. Mehmed the Conqueror styled himself as Kaiser-i-Rum, Caesar of the Romans, claimed that Roman legacy. This is exactly right. I love that we're talking about this. So, obviously, we have, and I'm taking us back a bit, we have the collapse of the West, the Western Roman Empire. And then, but the Eastern Roman Empire survives in what we will call the Byzantine Empire. But they knew themselves as Romans. And people sometimes get upset about this. I know they were Greeks, but they saw themselves as Romans, and frankly, they were Romans. I mean, what is it to be a Roman, right? And so the Eastern Roman Empire was the continuation of the Roman Empire. But since Rome had really fallen, the West had fallen, and it was in decline, there was a mad grab for Roman legacy. And so in the West, you have, for example, the Latins, the Catholic Church. You have the Holy Roman Empire, Charlemagne. You know, they also wanted to claim a bit of that Roman legacy. They wanted to take it from the Byzantines. Of course, eventually, though the Byzantine Empire survives for a remarkable amount of time, it falls. And it falls to the Ottomans. And what do the Ottomans do? They claim that Roman legacy. That's exactly what they do. Now, no one in Europe takes them seriously, because they very much view the Roman legacy as a Christian legacy. And of course, the Ottomans are a Muslim empire, though they had a lot of non-Muslim subjects. But to the Ottomans, they are the next Roman Empire. I mean, they defeated the Roman Empire, right? So that makes them the successors of the Roman Empire. So really fascinating look at how important Roman legacy was up until, basically the early modern era. Not to mention that, the Ottomans called Greek Orthodox Christians within their empire the Rum, aka Romans. So they recognize, this is a little point to the Byzantines. For those that don't recognize the Byzantines or the Byzantine Empire as Roman, the Ottomans did. They called them Roman, even though, yeah, sure, they were Greek. They spoke Greek. They were Greek Orthodox, but they were Roman. It's complicated. It's fascinating. It's just a look at how even after the collapse of the Roman Empire as a unified state, Rome survived through the Byzantine Empire. Rome survived through Christianity, both Orthodox Christianity and Catholicism. It survived through its laws, its institutions, its culture. It's just incredible how influential Rome was.
Baltic fleet sail it all the way around Europe and surprise the Ottoman fleet from the rear. The plan worked. The Ottoman navy suffered massive losses.
And yes, Russians had no port in the Black Sea. Very familiar story since Peter, probably before Peter the Great. Russia's been trying to expand, get some seaports that aren't frozen over for a lot of the year. And now they're heading towards the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. And who's in the way? Well, the Ottomans are in the way, but as we've talked about, the Ottomans are in terminal decline, which will continue. So the Russians are going to continue expanding.
At little cost to the Russians. But the Russians didn't get quite as much from the war as might first have been supposed, partly because of pressure from other foreign entities who didn't want to upset the balance of power too greatly, and partly because something curious was happening.
And this would happen a couple times with the Russians fighting the Ottomans. I think of the Crimean War in the mid-1800s, for example. Russia would go full force against the Ottomans because Russia wanted to claim all Ottoman territory. I mean, they wanted to keep going to Constantinople because, I can't believe we're bringing Roman legacy into it again, Russia saw itself as the third Rome, because they were the inheritors of the Orthodox legacy. And so they felt, you know what? No, we will lay claim to the Roman legacy and we will take Constantinople. They also wanted it, of course, for political and strategic reasons. So, in several wars against the Ottomans, when it got, too hot and Russia was going too far, other European powers would step in, as Light X7 mentions, Metternich's concert system, the balance of power. Other European powers like the British and the French, in the case of the Crimean War, would step in and block Russia, say, you're not going any further, buddy. We don't care about the Ottomans, but we need the Ottomans to be a buffer to you. And so these great powers, Britain and France, wanted to maintain a weak Ottoman Empire that, couldn't resist European domination, but was still there to act as mostly a buffer against Russia. Because if the Ottoman Empire was to fall, at least at this point, Russia would sweep in and take everything.
Back home in the Urals. But first we must talk of the treaty that ended the war, the Treaty of Kachuk-Kainarza.
Yep.
It gave the Russians a fair swath of
This is a very important treaty. Not very well known, but very important.
territory, but most importantly, it gave Russia ports on the Black Sea, which
Yep.
had been one of their strategic goals for a very long time. It also provided war reparations, which helped with the ongoing problem of Russia being kinda broke. Lastly, it made Russia the protector of Orthodox Christians living in the Ottoman Empire.
And this is the most important part. I mean, the ports are important too. And some of you might be thinking, why is this the most important part? Russia, the protector of Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire. That seems mostly symbolic. It's not. Let me tell you, it is not. Russia would use this status as the protector of Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire as an excuse time and time again to invade the Ottoman Empire and claim more territory. All the Russians had to do was point out some real or made up injustice that the Ottomans had dealt against Orthodox Christians, and Russia would swoop in and take more territory. And at this point, we're starting late 1700s into 1800s. getting the development of nationalism. And so a lot of these peoples throughout the Ottoman Empire, the Serbs, the Greeks, the Bulgars, etc., they want their own states. And a lot of these people are Orthodox. Now, not all of them. We have a lot of different peoples in the Balkans. We have Catholics, and we also have Muslims. But a lot of these peoples are Orthodox, and so they see Russia as their natural ally. And so this gives Russia a casus belli to just invade basically whenever they want. They don't need much.
Something that will absolutely come up if we ever cover the Crimean War.
Yep.
Alright.
Hey, there you go. They mentioned the Crimean War too.
So, with the war against the Ottomans thus concluded, Catherine could turn to another niggling issue, the fact that half of her country was up in arms. At first, it seemed like a small revolt, a little nothing out in the boonies. But then, when Catherine sent a force to pacify it, that force was defeated. So she sent another force out to pacify it, and the commander lost his head. Literally. This was getting to be a problem. In fact, it was a huge problem, one that would require the help of some of those troops that had been tied up fighting the Ottomans to solve. Because what had started out as a small group of discontented Cossacks...
Here we have Pugachev's rebellion. How did Russia lose the Crimean War by History March? Oh my goodness, another addition to the list. The list only grows longer. There's so much history content on YouTube. I mean, my goodness, I knew that already, but you guys always surprise me with these suggestions. It has been officially added to the list. The official list.
Had grown into the largest peasant rebellion Russia had ever seen. The horrible conditions of serfdom, the increase in tax collectors and government officials messing with Cossack affairs, and discontent of the old believers with the Orthodox hierarchy meant...
Japanese battleship Mikasa from the Russo-Japanese War is the only pre-dreadnought battleship to be converted to a museum ship. Huh. Interesting.
That these groups had become dry tinder just waiting for a lit match. And a man named Pugachev had fanned that discontent into a firestorm. Pugachev claimed that he was Peter III, that he had escaped the attempt on his life, and that his wife and the evil nobles had deposed him because he was about to sign into law a decree freeing all the serfs.
And so this is a very interesting uprising. So Pugachev claims he's Peter, right? And so you can see it's an interesting setup. The serfs are upset with their treatment, but they still hold loyalty to the Tsar. And you see this with a lot of things throughout this time period and medieval history. Whenever there is an uprising or dissent or people are upset, they will usually not direct their anger at the monarch. They will say something like, oh, well, the monarch's advisors are getting in the way. His ministers are deceiving him and tricking him. And so Pugachev is pulling this one step further. He's saying, I'm Peter, the legitimate Tsar, and my wife, an illegitimate leader, and, her noble allies have kicked me out of power, and it's them who are abusing you, serfs. I want to free you, I, the legitimate Tsar. And so he probably claims he's Peter in order to give sort of this legitimate beacon for the serfs to rally around. Because the serfs are true believers in the Tsar. I mean, they've been taught this their whole life. They really do believe it. They believe that if they have a problem, all they need to do is tell the Tsar about that problem, and the Tsar will fix it. And whenever their problems aren't fixed, they say, well, it must be those greedy nobles or those deceiving ministers who have prevented the Tsar from helping us. And so I think that's why Pugachev frames it like he's doing. Decree to free all serfs. Yeah, who does he think he is? Alexander III? Yeah, Pugachev, a little early. He's preempting them. And, more radical than Peter ever would do. But we did see earlier that Peter did pass some legislation that was friendly towards the serfs. So, this could be, maybe not believable, but somewhat in the realm of believability. Of course, Peter was already dead, so... But, a lot of people believed that Pugachev truly was Peter.
He was also offering freedom of religion and a tax-free return to the traditional way of life for the Cossacks. To a lot of people,
Wow.
that sounded like a pretty good deal.
Sounds like a good deal to me.
And for a year, they held sway over vast parts of Russia, often dealing savagely with any nobles unlucky enough to cross their path. But at last, as the troops began to pour back from Ottoman lands, Catherine sent out an overwhelming force to snuff out the rebellion. But even as this
Tax-free? Sign me up. Sign me up with Pugachev.
fire was being put out, a much worse specter flared up. Smallpox.
Uh-oh.
Smallpox was still the bane of Europe.
Yup. And I wonder if we're going to talk about smallpox inoculation here. If they don't, I will, but I won't preempt them if they do.
No one was safe from it, noble or commoner, king or priest. It had just burnt through the Austrian royal family, destroying their line of succession. And here Catherine was, never having contracted it. Perhaps worse still, here her son was, with whispers all around court of the uncertainty of his ever ascending the throne, because he had not yet suffered and survived the disease.
Uh-oh.
Catherine herself said that she lived in fear of the disease every day. Too many people she had known had been claimed by it. So, at last, student of the Enlightenment that she was, she took a bold step.
Yep.
She summoned a doctor from Britain to inoculate her. This science was fairly new at the time, and though the doctor she brought in was one of the experts in the field, everyone thought her mad.
Yes. This was very new, and a lot of people were really not into this whole inoculation thing. But, as we know today, as Light X7 puts it, let's take a moment to appreciate modern medical science. That's exactly what this is. This is a massive step in understanding and a massive step in medicine. And to her credit, Catherine, she's not at all the first person to do this, nor the first prominent person to do this, but she really pushes it forward. You know, she becomes a bit of a standard bearer, and uses herself as an example, right? I mean, if you want to convince people that something is safe and effective, what better way than to do it yourself? And that's what she does. And she sets a good example for people, particularly nobles in Russia, but also people throughout Europe, educated and elite people throughout Europe.
Many were convinced that she would die, but she lived. After a few small pustules and some aches, she was fit and forever inured against the disease.
Yeah. And, you know, if you think about it, there were a lot of doubters. Of course, it does seem kind of intuitive to us, but you can also imagine how, you know, inoculating, dosing yourself with a small bit of the disease might sound a little crazy, a little dangerous to people who don't understand or, you know, doubtful. But Catherine had confidence. She went through with it. And, you know, a success, obviously, as we know.
Soon, she had her son inoculated too. But she didn't just do this for herself. She knew that her people were a wary, suspicious people, especially when it came to disease. She hoped that, by her example, she could convince others to get inoculated too. And it worked.
Yep.
Soon, much of the court followed her example.
Yep, and like I said, not just in Russia. You know, Catherine, as all monarchs usually are, she was an international figure. And like Frederick, she, you know, was able to project good PR, project herself as this enlightened leader. And so in this case, her getting inoculated and inoculating her son was influential throughout Europe. Many European monarchs went on live TV during COVID and showcased that it was safe. Yeah, I remember the British royal family doing that. That is kind of funny. A real throwback, huh? But yeah, that does make sense. Yeah, I remember that. That's fascinating. A fascinating connection to this. Of course, two similar but also very different situations.
In fact, she had inoculation stations set up in most of the provinces, and a large number of Russians benefited from this, one of the true wonders of modern medicine. There would be other plagues during her tenure as Empress, some unthinkably terrible, but this one great lingering fear, this one tragedy that once fell on almost every house, this she was able to do something about.
Yep.
By the end of her reign, nearly 2 million Russians would be inoculated. But with the home
Not
front
bad.
quiet and her efforts on medicine and childcare taking root, it was time again to look beyond the borders of Russia, or perhaps more accurately, to the borders of Russia, and how they might be expanded. Join us next time for Changing Alliances, Sprawling Wars, and the Partition of Poland.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I think we're dealing with Poland next. Oh my, poor Poland. We're going to see, a real bad moment in Poland's history. For people like Catherine, Alexander, and Napoleon, it seems incredible once you realize how short their reigns were. Yeah. No, it really is true.
At a young age, Catherine...
Incredible influence in such a short period of time. All right, part 5. I will say I'm going to take a short break, only a couple of minutes. I need to use the bathroom. Plus, I'm going to move a lamp over here because it's getting dark where I am. So we're going to the Be Right Back screen, and I will be back very shortly, so stay tuned. Hello, everybody. We're back after that short break. Alright, so, what do we have left? Hello, everybody. Whoops. We're back. Got my own live stream playing in the background. We've got part 5 and part 6. I think we're going to try and finish this series. Though we may have one part left based on how long it's taking us. And then after we finish this series, or at least the next part, we'll probably end the stream, maybe with some light history chat, Q&A, and or you can give me more recommendations, because I know that's what you guys love to do. Alright, so let's jump right back into the story of Catherine. It seems like in this episode we're going to talk about Poland. Very fascinating topic. Polish history, modern Polish history is an interesting one. Mostly stateless. And we're going to see why at this moment, or during this video.
At a young age, Catherine had been married to an emotionally stunted young man who never loved her. For years, she had remained trapped, until she was won over by a callous rake who later abandoned her. She then met a man of whom she was very fond, and whom she would eventually make the King of Poland. But none of these men had truly won her heart. No, the man to be her first great love turned out to be the same man who had helped her ascend the throne years before, Grigory Orlov.
And you can see what I'm saying, when Catherine chooses her suitors, hey, she chooses pretty damn capable people. They have to have some impressive qualifications. So yes, on to Orlov.
For 13 years, she was faithful to him, but that was soon to end.
Damn.
Grigory Orlov was brave and bold, never flinching at danger or personal risk. But he was also boorish, rude, and impertinent. He was ill-educated, with no interest in any of the Enlightenment ideas that Catherine so fancied. Catherine would once write that, despite it all, she would have stayed with him for a lifetime, if only he stayed with her. But
Damn.
Grigory sought danger. He was restless, unfaithful, and, worst of all to Catherine, he had grown distant. She sent him off on a diplomatic mission. There he failed, displaying the same arrogance that he had displayed at court, the same uncouth rudeness and sense of superiority that had gotten him hated by her nobles. But it
Seems like Orlov is quite a character. Just on a personal level.
didn't really matter at this point. Catherine had sent him away because she was already done with him. Too
Damn.
long had she suffered his infidelity, his harsh words, his sense that he was superior to the Empress herself. As his replacement, Catherine picked up a safe, pretty, dull young man who she would rapidly come to call the most boring man in all of Russia.
That is brutal. Damn, I mean, I feel bad for that guy.
She found her time with him interminable. Not because he didn't try, and not because he was unrefined like Orlov, but because he never had anything interesting to say. But then, she found Potemkin. He had first caught her attention.
Potemkin, probably the most famous of Catherine's lovers. Also a very interesting character in his own right. Very talented in many ways, capable, so he's a fascinating fellow.
By giving her his sword knot on the day she took the throne. He had performed numerous services for Catherine. He'd been her envoy to Sweden, bringing word of the palace coup. He had been her lay representative on the Most Holy Synod. He'd been paymaster of the army, and he'd even been appointed as guardian of exotic peoples at Catherine's Great Assembly on Laws. He
Wow.
had served valiantly in the Turkish War, and won himself renown at every turn. He
Shout
was
out.
a cultured man, not only well-studied, but intellectually eager and curious. He had won the top honors at university, and then dropped out. He loved theology, but always, especially after being appointed guardian of exotic peoples, kept the company not only of Orthodox ministers, but also rabbis.
Seems like a curious, intelligent guy, but one who does things in his own way. He doesn't necessarily want to go down any specific route. He's curious, he's intelligent, he'll do it himself. Yeah, guardian of exotic peoples. Yeah, perhaps a little xenophobic, but not the title we would use today for sure, but it is kind of it's a funny sounding title. Guardian of exotic peoples. My goodness.
Old believers, Cossacks, and even members of the tribal religions still alive in the more remote parts of Russia. He was a great wit, known for impressions and being able to mimic people's voices, which I guess was considered high comedy in those days.
What do you mean? That's high comedy these days.
He could make Catherine laugh, and through humor, he could say to her what others couldn't say. He was bold, decisive, and highly competent.
Wow.
And soon,
A glittering image of Potemkin.
Catherine fell in love with him. He was the love of her life. She probably married him. It's one of history's great mysteries, as the wedding would have had to have been a secret, and no documents of the event survive, but in her correspondence, she starts referring to him all the time as her husband,
Wowee, how about that?
and to herself as his wife. He was the first man who she felt was her equal, at least in everything but rank, and he was active in all aspects of court and governance.
Yeah, I mean, Potemkin is a capable guy. Like I said, Catherine chooses her suitors well, I suppose. He's certainly, I mean, I don't know if they were actually, like, equal in intellect or capability, but he certainly measured up to her in many ways. And it appears that that was definitely what she was looking for, especially after her marriage to Peter, who was basically her inferior in every way except for rank.
Helping her to execute her will. But, and tragically for Catherine, there is always a but, he was deeply insecure about their difference in power. For all his qualities, Potemkin could never get over the fact that she could make or unmake him in an instant if she...
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about this elite fella during this time period, and Catherine is a female czar, a female empress, in her own right, And so I can imagine he might feel a little insecure about that. You can, considering the circumstances, that does make a bit of sense. That's interesting, Suam. I honestly don't know much about Catherine and her view on the American Revolution. But yeah, that's interesting. And makes sense. I mean, the thing about the American Revolution is that, as opposed to the French Revolution, which was very immediate and was affecting everything, the American Revolution was very far away, and for a lot of European powers, I think it was more a way to deal with Britain, right? That's what it was more about. It was more about politicking with and around Britain instead of the colonies themselves. Versus, of course, the French Revolution, which was literally France rising up and murdering its king. That was much more immediate, much more impactful to Europe in an immediate sense. So, that does make sense.
She wished that all the power in their relationship was firmly on her side.
Yeah, exactly. Light X Heaven puts it best. Stick it to the British. And this is why countries like France would help the American rebels. They just wanted to stick it to the British. That's exactly the point I'm making. For a lot of European powers, was not about the patriots in America. It was about sticking it to the Brits.
Every day, he required assurances that she wasn't going to leave him. When she paid attention to any of her former lovers, his jealousy flared. So certain he was that she was about to cast him aside for an old favorite.
So Potemkin is needy. That's what I'm getting from this. He's a little bit needy.
He alternated between melancholy and anger, and nothing she could ever do could convince him that he wasn't just a passing fancy, that he really was what she wanted. And in time, the strain of this broke them. Things got miserable. She spent days in tears, and he hiding in work or in another part of the palace. Passion and love were still there, but they were translated into recriminations and bitterness. At last, she finally decided to see other people. But rather than this destroying what they had,
and this is the interesting part about their relationship,
it strengthened them. While their physical relationship was done, they maintained an incredibly strong bond that simply grew as Potemkin came into his own.
I think they must have... they were basically soulmates. They were lovers for a time, and then they ended that relationship, and both... Obviously, we know more about Catherine. Catherine would go off and take many other lovers, right? She didn't have that relationship with Potemkin anymore, but they became closer. A lot of the bitterness disappeared, and they stayed extremely close throughout both of their lives. They loved each other in some way. I think they were basically like soulmates or something. It's a remarkable relationship. They must have really had a lot of love for each other. Passion and true love was a rarity for monarchs of this age. Yeah, that's true. And Catherine found that person, and though, we're seeing they sort of romantically split, they stayed close in many ways. And of course, if we're looking at it from a more political sense, Potemkin was a very effective subordinate. He was someone, you wanted to have him on your team.
Not as her lover, but as her minister. Catherine would abandon lovers if they spoke ill of Potemkin or were jealous of the space he had in her heart. And Potemkin would serve her loyally all his life, even introducing her to young men with whom he thought she might fall in love. Their loyalty to each other would overrule any other relationship and any other concern. And from here, they could turn to external affairs. Catherine dispatched Potemkin to deliver one of the largest series of territorial gains in Russian history. As part of the Treaty of Kachuk-Kainarja that ended the First Ottoman War, the Crimean Khanate was guaranteed independence from the Ottomans, a guarantee that was backed by the might of Russia. But Catherine and Potemkin saw an opportunity. The great powers of Europe were embroiled in other wars. No one would be able to raise more than a meek protest if faraway Russia expanded her empire. And so they struck while the iron was hot and...
Yep, we've got some realpolitik at play.
annexed the Crimean Khanate, an action whose consequences reverberate through to today. Soon after...
Yep. I mean, of course, this is probably more pressing than ever with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has been going on for a while now. But yep, they took the Crimean Khanate, which was its own thing, and Russia has been obsessed with Crimea since. There are several instances of that. Catherine was blessed with many great generals and admirals, some of them the finest in Russian history. Yeah, I know less about Catherine's generals and admirals. I think because she's so famous, she's outshone many of them. But that's interesting. I mean, look, if you want to achieve as much as she did, and I think people often forget about the military conquests of Russia during this period, in favor of Catherine's social policy, domestic policy, you're going to need some really talented subordinates, some talented generals and admirals, right?
They moved to annex the Kingdom of Georgia, and as no one had raised an objection to the bloodless takeover of Crimea, Catherine and Potemkin were sure that there would be even less objection to this expansion into a little thought of territory to Russia's south. And they were almost right. No one in Europe really did much about it, but there was one group that cared, and that was the Chechens. And so this action too would have consequences that would echo into today.
Yeah, I mean, they're sort of making the point for me, and, we don't want to draw too close a connection sometimes, but, it's absolutely fair to say that we're really seeing modern Russia being built at the moment. And that's been true since, really, Peter, to be honest, and before Peter. But we're seeing some things that will really be important throughout the remainder of Russian history. Crimea, the Chechens, there will be a lot of conflict between Chechnya, or the Chechen people, and Russia throughout the years. Of course, there's been, conflict several times over the last couple of decades, but even outside of that, there's been a lot of conflict. So, yeah, oh boy, the Chechens is right. This absolutely is something that will remain important throughout Russian history.
Potemkin was then set to rule the south of Russia, to build cities and bring colonists into these new areas, to pacify hostile tribes and create a new and mighty Black Sea fleet. And though all of these expansions brought Russia back into conflict with the Ottoman Empire, where Potemkin had previously been but one of a myriad of generals in the first conflict, here he was supreme commander. He led with aplomb, delivering a number of smashing victories to Catherine.
Wow.
But
I knew Potemkin was talented and capable. I mean, you can't really miss Potemkin if you're telling the story of Catherine the Great, but I did not know he was responsible for a lot of this stuff. Seems like he was truly a great leader in his own right, in many ways.
Shortly thereafter, he fell ill and passed, dictating only one last letter to Catherine before death took him. He was a man of luxury and debauchery, of unswerving faithfulness on utter profligacy, of towering ego and absolute insecurity, with appetites to match his intellect and his ability.
I mean, look, he was a human being. We often have contradicting traits within us. So in that, he was similar to most people. But clearly with Potemkin, a lot of these things were elevated, right? And that's sort of the reason he was so great, because he had many of these traits in spades that made him this charismatic, intelligent, capable leader.
But perhaps the Austrian Field Marshal Linia put it best. I here behold a commander-in-chief who looks...
Here comes the longest recital of extra credits history about Potemkin. Really? Okay. Well, I'm ready.
...idle and is always busy, who has no other desk than his knees, no other comb than his fingers, constantly reclined on his couch, yet sleeping neither in night nor in daytime. A cannon shot to which he himself is not exposed disturbs him with the idea that it costs the life of some of his soldiers. Trembling for others, brave himself. Alarmed at the approach of danger, frolicsome when it surrounds him. Dull in the midst of pleasure, surfeited with everything, easily disgusted, morose, inconstant. A profound philosopher, an able minister, a sublime politician, not revengeful, asking pardon for a pain he has inflicted,
Seems a pretty damn impressive man, huh?
quickly repairing an injustice, thinking he loves God when he fears the devil, waving one hand to the
Also giving a pretty good idea of this guy's character. You really get the sense of this charismatic leader who's flitting about, always on the go, not held down by anything. He's his own man. He's capable in his own right. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how long this is going to last, but I'm already... I mean, we've had a whole video that... A lot of it was about Potemkin, to be honest. I'm surprised. But, you know, I feel like we are getting a good idea of his character.
females that please him, and with the other making the sign of the cross, receiving numberless presents from his sovereign and distributing them immediately to others, preferring prodigality in giving to regularity in paying, prodigiously rich and not worth a farthing, easily prejudiced in favor of or against anything, talking divinity to his generals and tactics to his bishops, never reading but pumping everyone with whom he converses, uncommonly affable or extremely savage, the most attractive or repulsive of manners, concealing under the appearance of harshness the greatest benevolence of heart, like a child wanting to have everything, or like a great man knowing how to do without, gnawing his fingers or apples or turnips, scolding or laughing, engaged in wantonness or in prayers, summoning 20 aides de camp and saying nothing to any of them, not caring for cold, though he appears unable to exist without furs, always in his shirt without pants, or in rich regimentals, barefoot or in slippers, almost bent double when he's at home, and tall, erect, proud, handsome, noble, and majestic when he shows himself.
The first spam that we've had in chat, brilliant. Love to see that.
To his army, like Agamemnon in the midst of the monarchs of Greece. What then is his magic? Genius, natural abilities, an excellent memory, artifice without craft, the art of conquering every heart, much generosity, graciousness, and justice.
Yeah, we're going big spam in chat. Love to see it. Yes, and, you know, I'm moderating my own chat, so hopefully we won't get much more spam, but if we do, then I just get on it as quick as possible. Hopefully, I mean, I get a good amount of spam on my videos. Maybe not so much these days, because I have specific phrases banned, and, you know, specific users banned. So, you know, always annoying, but, you know, we are truly going big now.
In his rewards, and a consummate knowledge of mankind. However you view him, he served Catherine to the end.
Wow.
And in the end...
Quite a description of Potemkin. I always like getting more detail on particular people. That's always cool. It seems like he was really important to Catherine's reign, but I'm surprised that the whole video was on Potemkin. We had 2 minutes on Orlov and her other lovers, and basically the entire video was on Potemkin. Kind of surprising, to be honest. Not saying I didn't enjoy it, but it's an interesting use of an episode, I would say. Especially when we have a lot left to cover of Catherine. We've got one more episode, and we have the partition of Poland to cover. That could be an entire episode in itself, along with the emergence of the French Revolution and Catherine's response. So, that's a lot to cover. The Belisarius of Catherine's reign. I'm getting that impression. I didn't know Potemkin was so important, but from the way they're describing it and that comparison, it seems like Potemkin really was the right-hand man of Catherine in all ways. So maybe he is due this sort of time, because he does seem a lot more important than I knew.
Was the love of her life. Before his death, though, there was one thing that Potemkin didn't get to resolve, and that was the matter of Poland. Join us next time as we delve into the disappearance of Poland.
Okay, they hinted at Poland last time, and we didn't get to it, but we truly do have to get to it this time. Yep, we've got one more episode to go. Okay. Yeah, Strobex. I mean, I don't mind that, you know. I do like giving character to some of the other people in this story. You know, particularly when we have a series focused on one person like Justinian or Catherine. Of course, you know, it's about them, but there's a lot of people that need to work to achieve the goals that these great figures had. So I don't necessarily mind spending time on other people. I think that's a good thing. It is just, I think, I was a little surprised that we got this much on Potemkin. But it does seem like he was important. And I haven't seen extra history series on Justinian. It's on the list. But with Justinian in particular, I mean, he had a whole host of very important subordinates, including Belisarius, who really achieved the goals he put forward. So they're a big part of his story in particular. Okay. On to the last episode of Extra History's Catherine the Great series. So we are going to watch this episode, then we're probably going to wind things down a little bit. Like I said, we can chat a little bit after this. You guys can send me some more video recommendations. But first, let's finish this, and we'll have finished Extra History series on Catherine the Great.
Once the terror of Eastern Europe, Poland had long been in decline. Catherine...
Yep. Poland's Lithuania was probably the biggest empire of Eastern Europe at one point. Bigger than Russia. More, certainly at points, more powerful than Russia. At this point, that has flipped. Poland has shrunk down. It's become less powerful. It's very weak. In many ways, it's already a puppet of its neighbors. And Russia has grown to this massive, important power in the region. And so, that trend of Poland losing power is going to continue. Yeah, decline is an understatement. It certainly is. I don't know too much about Poland-Lithuania. It's something that is so important and like such a big empire on the map, but I really don't know too much about it outside of what I know about it in relation to, say, Russian history. I know a lot about more about the partition and the end than I do of most of its history. Poland's national anthem mentioning Napoleon got me listening to and studying other anthems for history and context. That's fascinating, Suam. I didn't know that their anthem mentioned Napoleon, but I can understand why. I mean, a lot of Poles fought for Napoleon during the Napoleonic Wars. Of course, he created the Duchy of Warsaw after Poland had been completely partitioned, so I know there was a lot of Polish loyalty to Napoleon, and considering that following the Napoleonic Wars, Poland would be... you had the creation of Congress Poland, which was then eventually just fully absorbed into the Russian Empire. The Duchy of Warsaw was, probably Poland's best chance from the partition up until the 20th century, really. So that makes sense when I think about it.
Aimed to make that decline permanent. When Catherine first made war on the Ottomans, the biggest losses ended up being suffered by the Poles rather than the Ottoman Empire. For years, Catherine had a puppet, a former lover, on the throne of Poland, but keeping him there, and keeping him doing the bidding of Russia, was becoming more and more difficult.
Yeah, sometimes.
Vast amounts of troops and treasure were required to keep Poland passive, and as you might remember, the first Russo-Ottoman conflict was, at least officially, caused by Russian troops chasing Polish rebels over the border into Ottoman territory. But Poland was at the center of everything. Literally. The three great powers in Eastern Europe at the time were Prussia, Austria, and Russia, and in the middle of all of them sat Poland. So Poland became the solution for a very thorny problem that faced the King of Prussia, Frederick the Great. You see, Frederick had agreed to a secret alliance with Catherine, but the terms of it were very specific. If either of them fought with one of the other powers, all the other had to do was provide some financial support. But
we can already see a lot of behind-the-scene deals. Prussia and Russia are lauding their power over Poland, and of course, the third party, Austria, will be brought into the picture. They're talking about that Polish monarch. I think it was Stanislaw August Poniatowski. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but he was a puppet of Catherine, but he acted out a little bit, particularly as time went on. He was clearly uncomfortable with being in the position he was in. He was uncomfortable with being a Russian puppet. He wanted Poland to be more independent. I think he was probably guilty. Like, he felt guilty. So Poland was incredibly weak, but it was still a bit of a problem.
If either was attacked and ended up fighting two powers, well, the other one had to go all in, joining their side. Now, Frederick really didn't like the idea of actually militarily supporting Russia. He wanted them on his side and all, but the 7 Years' War had really done a number on his forces and his treasury.
Yeah, well, Frederick doesn't like the idea of militarily supporting anybody if he doesn't have to. He wants them as allies. Frederick the Great, we mentioned earlier, Light X Heaven made the point that maybe he's not as militarily great as he is remembered as, but he was certainly very capable and intelligent. We can look at his domestic politics or his international politics. He made some mistakes and did get Prussia in some dangerous positions, but he was pretty good at geopoliticking Prussia from the position at the start of his reign to the far more important European power it would become.
And in the Ottoman conflict, Russia was being a true pain and stomping the Turks far more than anybody really thought they would, which of course worried Austria, who needed the Ottomans as a counterbalance to Russia.
Yup. We're already seeing this balance of power emerge. Now, it's only really made official at the Congress of Vienna with Metternich's Concert of Europe, but, with balance of power is a sort of intuitive way to go about it, You don't want your enemy getting too powerful, and so in order to prevent that, maybe you'll have to lend a hand to your other enemy to prevent that from happening, right? So if you're doing realpolitik, if you're viewing politics in this sort of realistic way, which these leaders all are, then I feel you may be sort of naturally led to this sort of balance of power way of doing things.
Naturally, this meant that the Austrians were about to join the war on the Ottoman side, which would mean that Frederick would have to do the very boring and unfun act of honoring his treaty.
Yep.
But Frederick was a crafty fellow. He pondered the problem and did what he seems to have usually done, and asked himself, how can I kill a whole bunch of birds with one stone?
Yep, and I said, Frederick would rather not have to honor his treaty. He's an intelligent fellow, he's good at geopolitics. We're going to see an example of this now.
Because he really wanted a couple of things. First, he didn't want to have to send troops to fight some Russian war. Second, he wanted the Ottomans to owe him, in case he ever needed to use them against the Austrians or the Russians. And then there was this thorny issue of that big gap in his territory, making it much harder to defend.
Yep.
So, he proposed a solution. Rather than Russia continuing to kick the Turks around and taking large portions of their territory, what if they took a big piece of Poland instead? And then, to maintain the balance of power, Austria could go in and take the most populous parts of Poland, and he would just take this wee bitty bit over there, a bit that happened to be the most strategically important for him.
Yup. Frederick was good at this kind of thing. He's maneuvering to get specifically what he wants. But he was very good at framing it as sort of an equal trade, He would say, look, you get this, and I get this, and that's not a big deal, right? And in a larger context, maybe it's not a big deal, but Frederick gets exactly what he wants. And as you can see, Austria is sort of brought in as the third party to maintain this balance of power, and because, they want to be included in any deal between these two. Austria's like, come on, agree to the deal.
And provided him more ports on the Baltic. So his solution was proposed, and basically everybody was like, sure, that works. And so, with plenty of urging from the surrounding Russian soldiers, they got...
Yeah, Frederick was the most enthusiastic proponent of this partition, I'll put it that way. But he managed to get the other two to agree to it.
Catherine's puppet in Poland to call the Polish version of a parliament to ratify the agreement. Of course, not enough members showed up to actually ratify the thing, but that wouldn't be a problem. The first thing those who did show up decided to do was change the rules, and thus huge segments of Poland became Russian, Austrian, and Prussian overnight.
Yep.
From then on, anytime Poland did anything Russia didn't like, Russia would just send the troops in. Then,
Yep. And, as we mentioned, the downfall of Poland had begun long before this, but this first partition, this is truly the beginning of the downfall of Poland as an independent state. I mean, this is it. After this point, not that it could really go back before this point with how weakened its position was, but after this point, it just continues to get its territory eaten up by these European powers right next to it that are far more powerful than Poland is. And this is going to happen until there is no Poland.
Prussia would suggest that they all just take another bite out of Poland, until finally, near the end of Catherine's rule, everyone just agreed to do away with the nuisance that was the ever-in-revolt state of Poland.
Yep.
But as Catherine's life came to its close, and the last chapter in the reign of Catherine the Great was being penned, all thoughts were on one thing: the succession. And here, perhaps, for all of Catherine's triumph...
Interesting. I think we're going to get to something that we mentioned earlier, Catherine the Great's successor, and how that went exactly. I'm curious if we're going to talk about the French Rev in this one.
was her greatest failing, the place where her own weaknesses and insecurities show through. The tragedy of her reign was that she left behind no one to carry on her legacy. After her, Russia would never again have a truly great emperor.
Let me think about it. Yeah, that's true. We will have a lot of czars after Catherine, and they will range from terrible to good. A lot will be somewhere in the middle, but I think they are right. After Catherine, there will be not another great, truly great czar of Russia. The best we get is, good. But yeah. Though, and I think part of this is due to Catherine, at least in terms of her son. She didn't really set him up for success, but also having a system like this, a dynastic monarchical system, it's pretty hard to guarantee that you're going to have another great emperor down the road unless you completely mix up how successors are chosen, which, she obviously didn't do.
Her son would grow up to be like the husband Catherine had despised. When he was born, little Paul had been whisked away by the then Empress Elizabeth. For 8 years, Elizabeth had had maids and servants raise the boy, and when he was at last returned to Catherine, there was a distance between them that could never be bridged.
Yeah.
The young man expected the warmth and attention that he'd never received during those years apart from his mother, and while Catherine tried, Paul would always be jealous of the men in Catherine's life.
Yikes. That's some sort of complex, eh? Yeah, they had a distance between them, and I don't know how much Catherine tried. I'm sure she did a little bit, but as maybe that we'll see, it's my understanding that when Paul came to maturity, was, a teen, a young adult, his mother really did not include him on a lot of those important meetings, a lot of the decision-making, a lot of the authority that he would need to wield while he was Tsar. She sort of pushed him away, but I'm curious to see how they frame it.
As she seemed to focus more of her energy on them than on him. And this was compounded by Catherine's own paranoia. She saw her son not as an assistant and an heir, but as a potential rival, as the one person who might have a more legitimate claim to the throne than she.
And this is exactly it. Instead of seeing Catherine's son as an heir, or instead of Catherine seeing her son as an heir, an assistant, someone to be educated in the ways of leading, she saw him as a potential rival. She was afraid that he could challenge her position. And, we've seen how autocratic Catherine is. She wants to maintain her own authority at any extent. And that includes pushing away her son, because she feels like he could be a threat.
So she kept him away from the halls of government, away from any responsibility, from being an actor in the affairs of state.
Yep.
And slowly, he took to idolizing the father who might not have been his father. He would...
Yep. And, we watched the earlier parts of this series earlier in this stream, and we saw how much of a buffoon Peter was. But you could understand why Paul would idolize his father. His mother pushes him away, doesn't treat him well, he's probably miserable, and so he idolizes. Peter may not have actually been his father, but he believed he was, and maybe he was. He idolized the father that had died, been murdered, perhaps on the request of his mother. He never knew his father, really. But you can understand why he did that. Or, I don't know how much he knew his father. I'm not sure how old Paul was when his father died, but probably very young, right? And so, I mean, looking at it from his perspective, you can understand why he felt this way.
He would play with soldiers and march his servants around like Peter had. Catherine and her closest advisors eventually decided this had to stop, and so they sought a wife for him, hoping that being married might make him grow up. But his first marriage ended in
Didn't work with Peter. I mean, being married didn't help Peter grow up.
deep tragedy. His wife died in the birth of their first son, and their son died with her. And as he was going through her papers, Paul discovered that she'd been carrying on an affair with his closest friend. He was laid low with grief. But he was convinced to marry again for the...
Yeah, I feel Paul has kind of been dealt a bad hand. And that sounds odd. I mean, he's been pampered from birth, of course, but, you can sort of understand why it turned out the way he did, based on how his mother behaved, and I'm sure this experience with his first marriage didn't help anything.
the sake of the state. His new wife was perfect for him. She supported him, eased his anxiety. Together they toured Europe, where for the first time he was feted and treated like a ruling member of some great state. And in these few months, you can see this possibility, this glimmer of hope in the letters the rulers of Europe wrote to one another upon meeting this young man, that he might be something more than his father. Was he perfect? Well, no, but they all remark on him being capable, intelligent, and, when his wife was at his side, able to let go of the anxiety and the paranoia that plagued him.
All right. I mean, hey, that's already a lot better than Peter, I feel if you're Catherine, if you're the Russian government, you want to foster those sort of things. You want to encourage those traits so that when it's Paul's time to rule, he'll be more good than bad.
But when he returned from Europe and asked to be part of the cabinet, Catherine again dismissed him, telling him that his trip had made him put on airs.
Wow.
He asked to fight in the army, and she said no. On every front, she still kept...
See, even when Paul wants to take more responsibility, which is good, that's exactly what he should be doing. Even when he wants to, Catherine won't allow it.
him from having any of the responsibility of state. And so he sank back down into his anxiety and his paranoia. And as he grew older, rumors abounded that Catherine was going to disinherit him for one of his own sons.
Wow.
Now, whether she actually did or not is one of those historical questions that will never really have an answer. Some say that she left instructions in her will to pass the empire to her grandson, but that Paul had had that will destroyed before anyone could discover it. Others say that she died before she made up her mind on the issue. But Catherine, forgetting some of the pains of her own childhood, let her insecurities prevent her from giving her son the training or the care that he needed to rule.
It's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. You say Catherine should have known better. I mean, based on her childhood experience, how she was treated, and based on, how her husband was, and Paul is becoming more and more like Peter, you think she should know not to do this, right? She should treat her son differently, include him, make him feel valued, give him responsibility, treat him like an adult. Unfortunately, she really hasn't learned any of those things. And unfortunately, I certainly don't think she treated him as badly as she was treated when she was a child, but he was in a different position, right? And she really doesn't give him the attention and responsibility that he needs in order to appropriately mature.
In the end, his paranoia became a self-fulfilling prophecy, and he would be assassinated not long into his reign.
Wow.
And the last days for Catherine saw other steps backward as well. The
Yep.
Pugachev rebellion had convinced her to step back from granting rights to the serfs, something that she...
So we are talking very briefly at the end about how Catherine stepped back from a lot of these more enlightened policies that she pushed earlier in her career.
She had considered doing in her younger days. And now the French Revolution made her doubt all of the Enlightenment ideas that she had so loved, and that in some ways had helped her carry her country so far.
Yeah. They're presenting it like a very sincere change of mind from her. I'm not sure if that was necessarily true, but she definitely did not want to associate herself with these Enlightenment thinkers anymore. With the radicalism of the French Revolution, she wanted to completely distance herself from the entire Enlightenment. She did feel that the French revolutionaries had sort of bastardized the Enlightenment, but she wasn't really interested in reclaiming it that much. She just wanted to leave it behind. And so she retreated from a lot of the enlightened policies which she had passed. Freedom of press is a good one. She'd introduced a measure of freedom of press. Russia, for the first time, was beginning to slowly develop a somewhat independent press. Upon the French Revolution, Catherine shut that down. Now, she's not necessarily unique in that regard. A lot of European leaders would limit press during the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. You could think of Spain, for example. Spain would extremely limit any news coming in from France. They're probably the worst example. But Catherine would do something similar, and given that she's remembered as this great Enlightenment monarch, it feels worthwhile sort of bringing this up alongside the rest of her legacy.
She banned private printing presses and made all works be approved by a censorship office. She even stopped the circulation of books by some of the very men she had corresponded with in her youth. And so, in the end, on the 17th of November, 1796, Catherine died of a stroke, leaving behind her a Russia that was larger, stronger, and more developed than ever before. She had championed health, maternal rights, and education. She had expanded the country on every border, from Poland to Georgia to Alaska. She patronized the arts, built great palaces and wonders like the Hermitage. Under her, the army had gone from a second-rate power scoffed at in the halls of Europe to something feared the world round.
Yep.
She issued the...
And that will be put to the test during the Napoleonic Wars. And of course, Russia will put up a pretty impressive showing during the Napoleonic Wars. Truly one of Napoleon's most formidable foes. I mean, really, after the British, it's probably the Russians, right? So yeah, she definitely set Russia up for success.
First Russian banknote and brought the Enlightenment to Russia.
Well, okay, that one's a little strong.
Though she began to step back from that Enlightenment and left Russia with a dynasty incapable of completing her legacy, it cannot be said that she was anything but the Great.
I agree. I think it's fair to call her the Great. If you look at how she empowered Russia, expanded its territory, cemented its political institutions, absolutely. She is Catherine the Great, and she did great things. I just have some quibbles, right? Some critiques. I think there's a little bit of nuance to mix in there, like the Enlightenment. Her Enlightenment was a very top-down one that was really, I think, more about cementing state power than bringing Enlightenment to Russia. Now, in the future, Russia's elites would begin to embrace enlightened and liberal ideas from the West, but that wasn't because of Catherine. A lot of that process actually began during the Napoleonic Wars, when a lot of elite Russians, Russian officers, who were, at that point, Russian officers were all aristocrats, traveled throughout Europe, fighting against Napoleon, and, of course, eventually defeating Napoleon, where they were stationed in places like Paris, where they would walk the streets of Paris, eat at French cafes, look at these books the French had, these Enlightenment philosophy books, and they would take a lot of these ideas and bring them back to Russia. That had nothing to do with Catherine, but her strengthening of the Russian army certainly helped during the Napoleonic Wars. So, I think she has a complicated legacy, but definitely a strong one. Whoops. All right. So that is the end of our Catherine the Great series by Extra History. I definitely enjoyed this one. Last stream, we did episode 1, and then this stream, we did 2 to 6. So, a lot more. Not to mention, we took a long time doing those first couple of episodes, but I certainly had a good time with this one. I think we're going to bring the stream to a close. If anyone has anything to say, feel free to say it. Feel free to make any further recommendations. If you guys have any recommendations for videos or series to watch in the future, I would be willing to entertain those. But if not, then I think we're going to end everything off here. So yeah, I'll give the chat a second to catch up. Seems like people are filing out. Ugh. Say a good stream overall. All right. Yeah, thank you, Strobex. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for all your support. I very much appreciate that. I believe, if I saw correctly, yeah, you joined the Patreon recently, so thank you very much for that. Thank you, everybody else, for being here. I appreciate all the comments. And if you're watching the VOD afterwards, if you got to the end, hey, thanks for watching the entire stream VOD. You're definitely a devoted viewer. So, that is basically the end of the stream. I think we had a good time with this one. I'll have to decide what I want to do for the next one. I intend to stream more often. We had a pretty big gap between the first stream and this one. And I'd like to do more streams. I think they're a good time. It's a good way to connect with the community. And in terms of our upcoming reactions, I'm doing the stream on January 7th. Next week, on Tuesday, so January 10th, we're finally beginning our series on Hannibal. So the first episode of our Hannibal series will be released on Tuesday, January 10th. And then tomorrow, on the 8th, we've got a new Historia Civilis, Battle of Actium. So we've got some good stuff to look forward to. I hope to see you guys then. I hope you enjoyed the stream. Hope you guys are having a good day today.